Jon Snow stood upon a low rise of rubble just north of the collapsed wall, the wind biting into his cheeks and stinging his eyes. The chill was beyond anything he had known at Castle Black, colder than any night patrol, harsher than the worst of winter storms. The sunlight, which had always been pale and fleeting in the far north, seemed entirely absent. Not even the memory of warmth reached this place. Before him stretched a plain of ice, snow, and shattered stones. Far beyond, silent in the gray haze, an army of the dead waited, their eyes shining an unearthly blue even in the gloom. He had come here alone. It had been the only way. Months earlier, though time had grown so strange in these last days, he had gazed out at the gathering threat from the battlements of Winterfell, from the broken edges of the wall, and from the scattered vantage points in the north that told the same story. The White Walkers and their legions of whites were unstoppable in a direct confrontation. They had obliterated Eastwatch and broken the wall by some dark magic or, as some insisted, by the grace of an undead dragon. The living forces had thrown everything at them. Dragon-glass-tipped spears, flaming trenches, dragon fire, the stout hearts of men, women, and beasts, but the others were endless, tireless. Even the greatest stands left only ashes for the living to cling to. So, in what he believed to be his final act, Jon Snow had abandoned his post at Winterfell. Many had begged him to stay, Sansa, Arya, even Daenerys in her own regal and furious way, but he slipped away in the night, taking only Longclaw and enough provisions to last him a few days. He left Ghost behind, though the direwolf had whined to follow, because he feared he might not return, and he wouldn't expose his faithful companion to this inevitable doom. He had wrestled with guilt and doubt every league he traveled. He knew his family and friends would think him a deserter, a traitor, or worse. They had come to rely on him for leadership. His name, whether he felt he deserved it or not, carried weight. He had united the North, had forged uneasy alliances, had achieved the impossible with the wildlings. But none of that power or hope was enough now. All that remained was the faintest sliver of possibility, a path so dark and unthinkable that he barely believed it himself. The notion had haunted him since he first set eyes on the Night King. In that terrible moment at Hardhome, standing on the deck of a boat fleeing the slaughter, Jon had felt an unspoken pressure in the air, a silent exchange across the roiling waters. The Night King had lifted his arms, raised the dead, and turned them into whites with an ancient, casual power. But in the gesture, there had been a cold curiosity, as if the other was remarking upon Jon's presence. It might have been his imagination, or it might have been something more. For too long, men had said the others did not speak, that they could not be reasoned with. He'd seen no evidence to the contrary, just glimpses of them leading their silent armies, their mouths never moving. But there had to be a will behind this onslaught, a reason for them to go to war. They were not mere hurricanes of swords and frost, but beings with purpose. If that was so, then there had to be a chance, however slim, that peace could be found. And so, Jon Snow had decided he would attempt to treat with the Night King. Night fell quickly in this forsaken stretch of the world. Jon's horse had collapsed 2 days earlier from exhaustion and had been devoured by whites that materialized from the darkness. He had run them through with dragonglass daggers until their eyes went dark, but the memory of their silent hunger gnawed at him more than any cold or hunger of his own. That was when he truly understood the risk. Turning back hadn't even been an option by then. The dead had him surrounded in a ring across the plains. When the horse died, Jon believed for a moment he would be next. Yet the whites had stopped short. They had backed away, blinking their hellish eyes, as though commanded. That had been his sign. The Night King knew he was here. If the Night King had wanted Jon dead, the chance had presented itself. The whites wouldn't have stopped. They did not think for themselves. They responded to their master. Jon realized the truth. The Night King was testing him, or perhaps, in a twisted sense, welcoming him. So now, standing in the center of a blasted landscape, Jon looked at the approaching ranks of the dead. Their movements were unnatural, each step in unison, their limbs stiff and contorted, but they made no move to rush him. Then the ranks parted, and through the parting line came half a dozen White Walkers mounted upon pale dead horses. They rode with eerie grace, their ice-forged weapons in hand. None of them brandished those weapons in immediate threat. They merely carried them as though they were a natural extension of themselves. Leading them came a figure astride a zombie stallion with rotting flanks and exposed bone. The figure's eyes were the brightest shade of blue John had ever seen. The Night King. John tried to swallow the dryness in his throat. He stood resolute, forcing his body not to shake in the wind. If he showed weakness here, it might be the end. He took a single step forward, letting the wind flap his heavy black cloak around him, revealing Longclaw sheathed at his belt. That Valyrian steel sword might kill White Walkers, but it was worthless against tens of thousands of Whites. Even if John managed a single blow, he'd be consumed in moments. He was placing everything on the hope of parley. The Night King halted some 20 feet from John. The other White Walkers fanned out behind him, forming a crescent. Their horses exhaled ghastly white clouds into the air, as though each breath was a final rattle stolen from some older winter. The Night King dismounted silently, his armor shifting with a faint hiss of leather and metal. He stood impossibly tall and carried a long spear of ice. His expressionless face, a mask of countless centuries, betrayed no curiosity nor anger. Yet John could feel something radiating from that inhuman gaze. They stood like that for what seemed an eternity, man and other facing each other while the wind howled. John, heart pounding, finally spoke. "Can you understand me?" There was no sign in the Night King's face that he did, but John pressed on, each word emerging in frosty breaths. "I came to talk. If there is a reason behind all this." He gestured at the army, the broken land, the freezing wind. "If there is a reason you wage war against the living, I want to know it. We have tried to fight you and we cannot win. You and I both know that. But what if there is a way to find a peace?" Silence answered him. The White Walkers in the half-circle studied him with equal detachment. John felt the tension building in his chest, the knowledge that he might be a fool. They never speak, but that did not mean they did not understand. He closed his eyes for a moment and recalled Sam's words, old records from the Night's Watch library, mentioning half-forgotten stories of pacts with the children of the forest. If men had once treated with the children, perhaps men had once treated with the others too. Perhaps there was a deeper, older truth hidden in the layers of time. John opened his eyes again, only to realize the Night King was closer. He had traversed half the distance between them without John noticing. Now he loomed tall, glacial, something both dead and timeless. Icy tendrils coiled around John's boots as if the ground itself was freezing beneath his feet. John resisted the impulse to step back. A voice came that John did not hear with his ears but rather felt as a razor-edged cold within his mind. "Why do you stand before me?" John's breath caught in his throat. It was not a voice as men spoke. It was more like a presence, a conscious scrape across his own being. He braced himself and answered, "I want to end this war without more bloodshed, if that is even possible." The White Walkers stirred faintly at the edges, but none attacked. The Night King's inhuman eyes bored into John's. A swirl of freezing wind swept between them, and John heard or sensed the response. Death is the darkness that covers the world. No realm is free of it. John forced himself to keep speaking in the face of that numbing, alien intrusion. We all face death, but the living should not be subjected to this. He glanced at the Whites. You make them puppets. There's no rest for them, no peace. He felt a curious pressure in his chest, and the mental voice answered, You carry the blood of ice and fire, the mark of those who break the cycle. John nearly flinched. Some part of him realized the Night King saw into him, saw the secret of his parentage, that he was Aegon Targaryen, that he held the fire of dragons within his veins even as he had been raised among the snows of the north. The others had no illusions. They existed on a plane of ancient awareness, beyond mortal distinctions of name or crest. In that strange communion, John felt an echo of possibility. He took a careful step. If I help you, he managed, though the words felt like shards of glass in his throat. "Will you cease killing the living?" A hiss like ice fracturing in the heart of winter came from the Night King. A single step closer, and Jon felt a primal chill radiate outward, creeping up his legs. Yes, the answer rocked him. It was not offered in pity or compromise, but as a statement of raw potential. Jon forced himself not to tremble. "What do you want?" "All that lives must serve. The armies of the dead cannot be halted, but they can be guided." Jon's mouth felt dry. He recalled the old tales of the last hero, of how the others came in the long night to extinguish all life. Could it be that the Night King sought a form of dominion that might be sated by something less than total annihilation? Jon asked, "Guided by me?" A ripple of discontent passed among the White Walkers. The Night King turned his head fractionally, and the rest became still again. Something akin to finality emanated from him as he turned his gaze back to Jon. "You stand between the warmth and the cold. Through you men might kneel." Jon remembered his vow to the Night's Watch, that he would protect the realms of men. He recalled his oath as king in the north, that he would shield the living from the storm. Every vow he had ever spoken warred in his mind with the knowledge that he could never defeat this enemy with swords and spears. There was no victory for him on the battlefield. Only a choice. Let the living be consumed or find another way. He did not realize until his breath hitched that tears were forming at the corners of his eyes. Tears that froze almost instantly on his lashes. "If I do this," he said, voice low and hollow, "no more innocents will be slaughtered?" "No slaughter." The Night King's silent voice echoed in Jon's mind. His frosty visage was as impassive as ever. "Only those who oppose me shall join the ranks of the dead. The rest shall accept the dominion of cold." Jon considered the monstrousness of that statement. If men laid down arms, they would live under a tyranny that might be just as horrific. But better than being turned into whites, perhaps. Better than a war that kills all. But is it truly living if you exist under the thrall of such power, always at risk of being turned upon? The moral conundrum twisted in him. How many thousands more would die if he refused? Humanity might be wiped out. This, at least, was a chance for them to exist. Could he truly refuse it? He had come here to talk, to bargain. Maybe that required a price. Maybe he had to sacrifice some illusions to save what he could. "If I agree," Jon said, voice trembling with the weight of it, "what must I do?" The Night King raised one pale hand. The wind around them intensified, and in the swirl of ice and snow, Jon imagined he glimpsed shapes from a distant past. The forging of the first White Walkers by the children of the forest, the betrayal that led to the long night, the cycles of death that had repeated again and again. It was a vision of old grievances, of cosmic balance, of the lingering fury that a creation once betrayed can never truly be undone. At the heart of it, the vision seemed to whisper. The living repeated their crimes. "We are the reckoning." The swirl died down, and the Night King lowered his hand. "Unite the living under one banner. Serve me, hold them in check, or the long night returns." A quiet pause lingered, then the mental voice added, "You will be the bridge." Jon's breath rushed out in ragged clouds. He had expected something else, some kind of immediate transformation and unholy ritual. But the White Walkers remained motionless. The Night King extended his hand, palm open, an ancient gesture of acceptance. Jon stared at it. This was the final moment, the threshold. He recalled every vow, every love, every death he had witnessed. The North needed him, and the living needed him. If surrendering his will to an alliance with the darkest enemy in history was the path to spare countless lives, could he do it? With a slow motion, heart-pounding, Jon reached out. When his glove touched that icy hand, pain seared through him like an electric jolt. He dropped to one knee. Frost bloomed along the edges of his cloak, creeping up the leather of his boots. He gasped, eyes wide, as he felt the unstoppable chill sinking into his bones. This is what it feels like to die, some frantic part of his mind screamed. But a moment later, his breath steadied, and clarity filled him. Clarity and coldness, but also purpose. He felt the presence of the Night King, ancient and cruel, pressing against him, forging a pact. The wind calmed. Jon stood once more, no longer gasping but breathing steadily in the sub-zero air. It no longer felt lethal to him, merely bracing, as though his blood had accepted the winter within. He realized the other had relinquished his hand. The entire army stood, tens of thousands of whites and White Walkers, watching. Jon was not one of them, not undead, but he felt a connection, a sense of the quiet hush that bound them all. The Night King turned, mounted his dead horse. With a beckoning thought, he urged Jon to follow. The ring of whites parted, granting him passage. Jon Snow, or what remained of the man who had once been Lord Commander, King in the North, nodded numbly. He began to follow, each step in the pristine snow an echo of the vow he had just taken. They rode, Jon on the back of a pale dead horse provided to him by one of the White Walkers, across the silent expanse where the wall had collapsed. Jon did not look at the frozen lumps that might have been corpses, or the dark patches of blood and gore left over from the last battle. A hush enveloped the entire land. The living would not come this way anymore, not if they valued their lives. Snow drifted from a leaden sky. Day and night blurred in that place where the sun never seemed to break fully free of the clouds. Yet, despite the monstrousness of what he was doing, Jon felt a surge of determination. If he could honor the terms, if he could bring the living under the same banner, maybe the killing would stop. Maybe, in some perverse way, the world could recover. He reminded himself repeatedly that he was doing this for those he loved. For Sansa, for Arya, for everyone in Winterfell, and even for Daenerys, who had fought so bravely to save the world. He would keep them safe from total annihilation. They might despise him for it, but at least they would be alive to do so. When the silent ride ended, they stood before a massive encampment. Or perhaps encampment was the wrong word. It was more like a necropolis of ice. Towers carved by the White Walkers out of ancient glaciers loomed. Whites patrolled in motionless lines along ridges of frost. Flickers of pale, ghostly light shimmered in translucent ice formations, conjuring illusions of architecture from some forgotten age. Jon dismounted, allowing the White Walker beside him to guide the undead horse away. The Night King advanced into the labyrinth of ice. Jon followed, every sense alert, unsure what to expect. They emerged into a large chamber, open to the sky but partially enclosed by sloping walls of sculpted ice. In the center of the chamber was a dais, ringed by strange runic shapes carved into the ground. The ice underfoot was so clear that Jon could see the dark earth beneath. There, on that dais, sat an icy throne, a spire of jagged crystal. The Night King ascended the steps, each step as noiseless as a phantom. He sat upon the throne and fixed his gaze on Jon. Jon stood before him, alone. The other White Walkers had fanned out around the periphery, silent sentinels in the gloom. Their armor caught the faint light, creating an otherworldly shimmer. The hush was so complete that Jon's breathing sounded loud in his own ears. He felt the Night King's presence in his mind again, like a frost-laced chain linking them. Claim your dominion among the living. Jon wondered how exactly to do that. The White Walkers seemed to have no use for maps or councils. He would have to go south again to speak with the leaders of men. But how could he even approach them without being slain on sight, especially when it was known he had ventured north alone? He forced himself to speak, though the communication was not wholly verbal now. I will travel south and give them the ultimatum. Bend the knee or face your wrath. Yes. The Night King's agreement settled over him like a cold wind. But men are proud. They will not kneel easily. They will kneel for me, Jon said, the words leaving a bitter taste on his tongue. They have trusted me before, fought beside me. I will make them understand. You are the bridge. Their acceptance or their doom rests on you. Jon bowed his head. I will go. Then he paused. But I need a gesture of trust from you. Send your armies no further south until I return. No more killings, no more raising whites. The Night King stared at him. The cold voice resonated. The storm is already unleashed. Jon's heart lurched. Stop it, he insisted. I can't secure their surrender if you continue slaughtering them. They have to know there is a chance for peace. Slowly, in a motion that did not seem natural for a being of ice, the Night King inclined his head. The white walkers around them shifted. Jon felt a wave ripple outward, like a command traveling through the silent horde. Satisfied, or as near to satisfaction as one could be in the presence of such cold, Jon nodded. He turned to go, ignoring the dread that snaked along his spine. As Jon made his way out of the necropolis of ice, he felt their eyes upon him. He was simultaneously captive and ambassador. Partner or puppet, he could not be sure. The horse was there waiting for him again. He climbed onto its back and, with a few cautious clicks of his tongue, guided it away from the frozen city. He did not look back. He had a long ride south. He would find a living horse once he crossed that boundary where the whites congregated thickest. Somehow he would slip past them, though he sensed that, under the Night King's protection, they would not attack him. His mind churned with the enormity of what came next. He had to face his family, his friends, the woman he might have loved, and confess his alliance with an ancient terror. Would they trust him? More importantly, would they obey? During the journey, he slept only in fits, half dreaming and half remembering the voice of the Night King. Scenes played in his mind of ancient times, of men committing atrocities, of children of the forest forging weapons too potent for the world. He saw cycles of betrayal, of heroes and villains repeating the same tragedies. It was all too vast to parse. When he awoke, hours or days later, he realized he had traveled far enough south that the sky had opened a fraction and the wind was a little less punishing. The horse beneath him moved on, unstoppable as if driven by an otherworldly impetus. At the edges of the living world, he dismounted and allowed the undead steed to wander back north. He could not bring a creature of the Night King's domain into inhabited lands without causing panic, and he did not trust it entirely either. For some time, he walked alone, letting the snow-laden hills gradually become more hospitable. Soon, he came across a small encampment of free folk, wildlings who had been traveling south to escape the horror behind them. They recognized him in an instant, calling him by name. Jon Snow. Tormund Giantsbane had roared, rushing forward with a mixture of relief and suspicion. "We feared you dead. Where in all the hells have you been?" Jon felt a pang, remembering Tormund's fierce loyalty and good humor. "I went to treat with the Night King," Jon said simply. It was not the greeting Tormund expected. His face twisted in confusion. "You what?" Jon said nothing more until they were inside a crude wooden structure that the wildlings had claimed as shelter. A small fire burned in a stone hearth. He looked at the flames as though seeing them for the first time in a long while. They gave him no comfort. Tormund and a dozen other wildlings hovered, uncertain, some ready to flee, others ready to fight if this was some trick. They respected Jon, but they had heard the rumors of monstrous events up north. "I went to see if there was a way to stop this war," Jon continued quietly. He did not miss the way the wildlings frowned, or how their hands drifted to weapons. He forced himself to speak calmly. "The dead are unstoppable in battle. If we continue to fight, every one of us will die. I found another way." Tormund narrowed his eyes. "I? And what is that way?" Jon's voice faltered. "Bend the knee. Accept the rule of the Night King." Murmurs of disbelief and horror echoed in the small space. Tormund took a step back as if he had been struck. Jon drew a shuddering breath. "He promises not to slaughter any more if we accept his dominion. No more whites, no more White Walker attacks. But we must bow." Tormund spat on the floor. "And you believe him?" "Yes," Jon said, remembering the mental connection, the sense of ancient oath behind the Night King's words. "The war can end. No one else has to die." One of the wildlings, a tall woman with a scar running down her cheek, hissed, "No one else has to die if we become thralls to a demon of ice? We free folk won't kneel to a southern king, let alone that thing." Jon clenched his fists. "He's not a demon or a god. He was created by the children of the forest. He's carrying out some twisted cosmic duty, punishing men for their expansions and betrayals. But he can be appeased. Tormund's face was grim. That is not living, Jon. It's breathing, Jon said, though his own voice sounded hollow to his ears. I've seen his army. If we fight, we lose. There is no winning. The wildlings turned angry and fearful. Tormund's fists bunched, though he kept them at his sides. I'm not sure I like what you've become, Crow. Jon lowered his gaze. I don't like it either, but this is the only way. He looked up, letting some of the new cold that resided within him show in his eyes. I must go south to Winterfell to speak with my family, and to everyone else who might stand in the path. Will you let me pass? Tormund studied him for a long time. Then he nodded, sadness etched into every crease of his face. Aye, you can go, but don't expect us to kneel. Jon couldn't bear to argue, so he simply nodded. He took what meager provisions they offered, perhaps out of old loyalty or pity, and left into the snow again. Behind him, a hush fell over the wildlings. He could feel their confusion and heartbreak, and he could feel the spark of the Night King's presence, urging him onward, deeper into his mission. He walked south. Over the following days, he encountered other travelers. Refugees, deserters, pockets of soldiers from the north who had retreated after the last disastrous battle near Castle Black. None welcomed Jon with open arms. Many were terrified, or suspicious, or outraged when he confessed his new purpose. Yet none drew steel against him outright. Some recognized that even their best efforts had failed to hold back the tide of the dead. They spoke of how many had died or risen to join the Night King's forces. Something in Jon's calm, unwavering tone made them believe that at least he had found a solution, however dark. At last, he came upon Winterfell's gates, closed against the cold and the threat of the dead. The guards there had changed. Too many had been lost. These were men from across the north who had rallied to the Stark cause. They recognized Jon immediately and let him in. News of his return spread through the courtyard like a wildfire. Men rushed around, desperate to find Lady Stark, the lords, and the dragons. Jon tried not to let his sudden trembling show. He felt an ache of longing for the family he had left behind. The walls, the archways, the snow-caked courtyard. They were more home to him than any place in the world, but it was all overshadowed by the knowledge of what he had to do. He did not protest as the guards escorted him to the Great Hall. Word had obviously reached the Highborn. When he entered, he saw Sansa at the high seat, wearing the mantle of the Lady of Winterfell, her auburn hair braided intricately around her shoulders. Seated beside her was Arya, her face as unreadable as a statue carved in ice. Bran was not present, probably in his tower or the Godswood. Surrounding them were the major lords of the North and the Vale, Davos standing near the dais with a grim expression, and near him was Brienne of Tarth, stoic and watchful. The hush in the hall was profound. Sansa rose. "Jon," she said, her voice tight with a tumult of emotion. "You came back." Arya's eyes narrowed. "Why did you leave in the first place?" Jon paused, scanning the faces that waited for answers. He saw fear, relief, curiosity, suspicion. All roads led back to him. He sighed, stepping forward so the entire hall could hear his words. "I went to find a way to stop the Night King," he said plainly. "I have done that." A stir of excitement and confusion rippled through the lords. Sansa blinked. "You found a way? Then the White Walkers are destroyed." "No," Jon replied. Silence fell again. "They are not destroyed, and they won't be. But I have convinced them to grant peace." Davos exhaled. "How?" The question carried the weight of the thousands dead, the countless atrocities committed in the last battles. Jon faced them all, summoning courage. "I swore an oath to the Night King. If we submit to his dominion, he will not kill again." Pandemonium broke. Lords shouted over each other, voices rising in outrage and horror. Lady Mormont, if she had still been alive, Jon thought bitterly, would have been the first to condemn him. Men demanded an explanation. Some sneered that he had gone mad. Others shouted that he had betrayed them. Sansa, up on the dais, put a hand over her mouth in shock. Brienne tensed, as if uncertain whether to draw her sword. The single person who did not look surprised was Arya, who only gazed at Jon with a hollow scrutiny. It was Sansa who managed to restore order with a raised hand. She addressed Jon, her face white as snow. "You cannot be serious." Jon took a breath. "Sansa, we cannot beat him in open war. Even with the dragons, with all the swords in the Seven Kingdoms, we lose. He has tens of thousands of dead. They do not tire, they do not fear. They will march until all are slain." A lord from the crowd roared, "Then we die. We do not kneel to that abomination." A chorus of voices joined him. Jon let their fury wash over him, but he raised a hand for silence. "I'm not telling you to kneel for my sake, but if we do not, everyone in the north will die, rise, and march south until they kill everyone there. And then the world will be an endless night. I came back because I promised him we would submit, that I would make you submit." Sansa's voice shook. "Jon, did he enchant you? Did you fall under some spell?" "No," he glanced at her sadly, wishing he could be certain. "This was my choice. I did it to save lives." Davos stepped forward, pain etched on his scarred face. "I followed you, Jon Snow, because I believed you to be the one who could save us. But this? You ask us to place ourselves under the boot of the Night King. How is that life? How is that any kind of future?" Jon's stomach twisted. "There is a chance. Once we stop the slaughter, maybe we'll find a way to rebuild, to endure, to find a new path. But if we keep fighting, that's the end of everything." The hall erupted again. Arya was the one to cut through the cacophony with a single word. "Enough!" Her voice cracked like a whip. She stared at Jon. "So that's it. We either follow you into this horror or we wait to be killed." Jon stared back at his sister. "That is it." Arya's gaze flickered with heartbreak. "I never thought I'd hear those words from you." She turned and walked out of the hall without another word. Sansa closed her eyes, tears threatening. As lords demanded an immediate condemnation of Jon, she lifted her hands, struggling for composure. Outside, a horn blew. A hush fell over the great hall as everyone turned. The horn sounded a second time, then the thunder of wings. A moment later, a roar shook the stones of Winterfell. Daenerys Targaryen had arrived on Dragonback. Jon winced. He had known this moment would come. Daenerys had not been present in the hall, likely away dealing with the threat of the undead or stationed somewhere to watch the northern passes. Now she had returned, summoned by the news of Jon's reappearance. The lords turned fearful eyes to the entrance as heavy footsteps approached. The hall's doors flew open, revealing Daenerys in her thick white and silver furs, hair braided regally, flanked by two of her loyal, unsullied guards. Her expression was thunderous. "Jon," she said, voice trembling with a swirl of relief, anger, and confusion. "Where have you been? Why have you left us in the dark?" Jon closed his eyes. "This was the hardest part. I went north to parley with the Night King. He has agreed to a truce on one condition, that the living submit to his rule." The color drained from Daenerys' face. "You can't be serious." He swallowed. "I am. I have pledged my support to him, Daenerys. It is the only way to keep everyone alive." A visible tremor passed through her. She took a step closer, ignoring the watchers around them. Her voice dropped in volume but not intensity. "Jon, after all we've done, after all I've sacrificed, do you think I'd hand over the world to that monster?" Jon's fists clenched. "I don't want it either, but we cannot defeat him. He will kill us all." Daenerys shook her head, tears of rage and hurt shimmering in her violet eyes. "Then let him kill us all, if the alternative is surrendering every freedom, every hope to an undead tyrant." Jon's heart ached. He thought of the life he might have had with Daenerys, a life that was overshadowed by war and their complicated lineage. "I can't watch everyone die," he said quietly. "We have to give the living a chance, even if it means bending the knee to a power we hate." She stared at him as if seeing a stranger. "You truly believe that is the only path?" Her words were not a question. Jon forced himself to nod. A taut silence filled the air. The lords and knights and common folk watched, tension bristling. Daenerys looked away, her jaw set. Dragons do not bend easily, Jon Snow. He thought of Viserion, the dragon the Night King had taken and turned. He already has one of your dragons. Could you risk losing the other two? Jon asked, his voice rough. They won't stop. If you fight, you'll lose them. Daenerys let out a quiet, shuddering breath, her sorrow for her lost child flaring anew. Finally, she spoke in a voice thick with heartbreak. If this is your choice, you can no longer be considered an ally to me. She turned to Sansa, though her words rang out for all to hear. Lady Stark, you have been a gracious host, but as of this moment, I must remove my forces from Winterfell if this madness persists. I will not stand beneath the same roof with a man who would place us under the Night King's yoke. I will not yield. Sansa, pale as a sheet, looked between Jon and Daenerys. We need your dragons, she said haltingly. You need hope, Daenerys replied sharply. Not this perversion of a truce. She turned back to Jon. If you have aligned yourself with him, you are no better than the cold darkness he brings. You have forced me to choose between you and my destiny, to break the wheel and free the world. Jon's own tears threatened to fall, but they froze in his eyes, turning to tiny shards. I understand. I'm sorry. Daenerys stared at him for a second longer, perhaps longing to find some trace of the man she had cared for. Then she spun on her heel and strode out, her unsullied following in disciplined silence. A roar from above signaled a dragon's cry, resonating in the old stones. Chaos descended again in the great hall. Some among the northern lords cried out for Jon's immediate arrest. Others screamed that Daenerys was abandoning them to death. A smaller number argued they should hear Jon out. Through it all, Sansa remained silent and still, struggling to form words. When she spoke, her voice trembled. Jon, you must see how impossible this is. Jon faced her. I know, but it's the only way. She shook her head, tears in her eyes. How could you do this? Jon had no answer beyond the one that had haunted him since he knelt before the Night King. To spare the living. Some guards advanced, uncertain whether to place him under arrest. Davos, still pale and stunned, lifted a hand to halt them. He is still a Stark, he said softly. We must at least weigh his words. But Sansa's voice, quiet and fearful, pierced the hall. Take him to the Solar. Let him rest there under guard. We will decide what must be done. Jon did not resist as armed men escorted him from the great hall. The fury and confusion trailed him in a rising tide. He caught a glimpse of Brienne's conflicted face, of the tear streak on Davos's cheek, of the burning betrayal in the eyes of the men who had once called him king in the north. He lowered his head, letting them take him away. This was the price of the choice he had made. If all ended in blood, then he would bear that shame. But if it meant they lived, perhaps someday they would forgive him. He spent that night in the old Solar, guarded by northern soldiers. The door was barred, but no one had taken his sword. He felt no urge to fight his way free. He merely waited. His mind drifted back to the cold presence that lurked in the recesses of his thoughts. He could sense the Night King's restlessness at the hold-up, the need for progress. He tried to calm that influence, though it left him feeling even more chilled. On some level, he realized that the Night King had placed a piece of his will inside Jon, forging a bond so that Jon could never truly escape. If he tried, whites would eventually come for him, or the Night King would drag him back by sheer force of that supernatural connection. Jon tried not to dwell on it. Instead, he prayed, though to which god he could not be sure, that it would not come to more violence. In the morning, Sansa and Arya came. They dismissed the guards and stood before him, two Stark sisters, gazing at the man who had once been their beloved brother. The tension in the Solar was palpable. Arya spoke first, voice clipped. Are you sure there is no other way? Jon looked at her, wanting to clasp her hands but wary. I've seen his power, Arya. Even dragons can't stand long against him. We can't keep dying for a war we can't win. She studied him in silence. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, and the lines on her face looked older than her years. "You say that, but I'd rather die fighting for freedom than live as a vassal to the dead." Sansa nodded, lips drawn in a tight line. "I cannot fathom being a subject of the Night King. We have all tasted tyranny before." She shuddered as memories of Joffrey, Ramsay, and other nightmares flickered through her mind. "I will not let that happen again to our people." Jon's frustration flared. That tyranny was from men. This is different. The Night King won't terrorize us for sport or cruelty. It's a cosmic order, a balance. If we obey, we live unharassed. Sansa's eyes flashed. And if we disobey once? Jon didn't need to voice the obvious. They all understood. The punishment for disobedience would be assimilation into the undead ranks, or annihilation. Sansa pressed on, tears in her voice. "Jon, we were free of tyrants at last. Now you come bearing a new tyranny even darker than the last. I will not accept it." Arya's hand hovered near the hilt of her dagger. Her eyes were glassy. "I love you, Jon, but if you bring this into our midst, you're not fighting for the living. You're condemning us to a fate worse than death." Jon clenched his teeth. A fate worse than death is endless war, endless slaughter until every single person, every child becomes a white. At least this way they survive. Silence rang in the solar. Sansa and Arya looked at each other, an unspoken exchange passing between them. Then, with a trembling voice, Sansa said, "We're calling a council of the Northern Lords. If you truly mean what you say, you will present this ultimatum. Kneel or die. If they refuse, will you stand aside as the Night King marches?" The question seared Jon's heart. "Sansa, if they refuse, I can't stop him anymore. My oath, he commanded me to make them kneel. I have to do everything in my power to ensure that happens, or the war continues." Arya bristled. "Everything in your power? Does that mean you would fight us if it came to that?" Jon lowered his head, voice breaking. "I pray it never comes to that." Sansa and Arya exchanged another look. Finally, Sansa said in a hollow tone, "Then the council it is. You'll speak to them. We'll see how the North responds." Jon only nodded, feeling the weight of doom heavy on his shoulders. They came for him later, leading him to the Great Hall once more. The hall was crowded with lords and knights, the main dais arranged for Sansa and Arya. Bran was there too, in his wheeled chair, his face inscrutable. The assembled throng quieted as Jon approached. Outside, the skies threatened snow. Winterfell's walls felt as though they were bracing for an earthquake. Jon found himself standing in the center of the room, a dais below the high seat. He looked around, seeing men and women of the North, the Vale, the Riverlands, some battered survivors from the southern holdfasts that had already been overrun. And behind them, a handful of Daenerys' loyalists, waiting to see if there might still be an alliance to preserve. Sansa stood, trying to project calm. "Jon Snow has returned from beyond the wall with an offer of peace from the Night King. He will explain." Jon's throat felt parched. The hush of the hall felt like static in his ears. He glanced at Bran, who stared back with eyes that seemed to peer into other realities. Then he breathed in and began, voice reso, nading as best he could. "The enemy we face is unlike any other," he said, turning slowly so all could hear him. "You have seen them. The dead, relentless, endless. We have tried to fight them on the battlefield, and we have failed. As the living, our strength is limited. We tire, we bleed, and when we die, they add our bodies to their horde. They have ancient magic we can't fully repel." A stir of discomfort spread among the crowd. Lords muttered, some nodding in fearful agreement, others looking defiant. Jon continued, "I went north to see if the Night King would listen, and he did. He offers a truce. No more death, no more whites raised from our ranks, no more war. Under one condition, we submit to his dominion. We cease any opposition and swear fealty to him. In exchange, he grants us our lives. There will be no further attacks. Winter will relent." At that, the crowd erupted in discord. Lords shouted their refusal. Others demanded they hear more. Sansa lifted her hands for silence, and gradually the storm of voices settled, though tension crackled in the air. A northern lord, his cloak heavy with fur, stepped forward. "You would have us kneel to that creature? Bow our heads to an inhuman force? What kind of life is that?" Jon answered, "It's the only life we have if we want to avoid extinction." Another lord snarled, "You speak like a coward, Jon Snow. We recall your bravery in battles past, but now you come as an envoy of the enemy, asking us to yield." Jon squared his jaw. "I speak as a man who has seen the truth. We cannot win. This is the only path that does not lead to the extermination of our people." A lady from the Vale stood, her voice trembling but resolute. "What guarantee do we have that the Night King will keep his word?" Jon forced himself not to flinch. He has held his forces at bay. He could have marched further south by now, taken more holdfasts. But he waits for me to fulfill my promise. He waits for you to accept. If you refuse, he marches. He will not stop until we are all dead and risen. A wave of murmurs swept the hall. The argument continued for nearly an hour, lords rising to proclaim their defiance, others admitting that might be the only way to spare their people a gruesome death. Sansa watched with mounting despair, unable to quell the tide of conflicting emotions. Arya's jaw was tight, her gaze on Jon as though he were a stranger. Davos stood on the sidelines, looking as if his heart was breaking. At last, Sansa lifted her voice to call for order. She surveyed the crowd. "We must decide," she said. "We can stand and fight, or we can kneel." She took a shaky breath. "I know the price of kneeling. I've lived under tyrants, and it is not a life I would wish on anyone. But if the only alternative is a horrifying death, and the extinction of our houses, then it is not a simple choice." That did not appease the outraged lords, who shouted for immediate war. A smaller faction supported negotiation. Many were caught in between, hearts at war with their instincts. Jon listened, his own heart heavy, until he sensed a presence behind him. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, had rolled his chair forward. Bran's soft, distant voice carried farther in the hush than one might expect. "I have seen many futures," he said. "In all those futures, we lose against the Night King on the battlefield." His eyes, touched with a kind of cosmic awareness, swept the hall. "If we fight him, we will be exterminated. The living will fall. Even the dragons cannot save us. This is what I have seen." The revelation stunned the lords into silence. Bran's powers as the Greenseer were known to some, rumored to others. The finality of his words chilled them more than the winter wind. Slowly, fear sank deeper into the crowd. Jon dared not look at Bran, for fear he might see condemnation in his younger brother's eyes. Instead, he addressed the crowd again. "That is why I made this choice. We must weigh the cost. Eternal night or subjugation. Perhaps in time we can find a way to break free. But if we die now, there is no tomorrow." A long silence stretched. Then a voice called from the back. "If we do this, is there any guarantee he won't simply kill us after we've knelt?" Jon shook his head. "The guarantee is my oath. I made a bond. He will keep it as long as we do. If we resist or break it, he will bring the storm upon us again." The crowd stirred. Sansa closed her eyes, seeming to reach a decision. Arya's face was stony. Finally, Sansa spoke, her tone measured but weighted with sorrow. "Then we must choose. Each lord, each lady, speak now if you will kneel or fight. I will not force you, but know that if you choose to fight, the Night King will come. And we cannot save you." An older northern lord spat. "I'll never bow to that evil. I'd sooner burn my keep and let him raise my bones than live under his yoke." Others voiced similar sentiments. Some wept, uncertain. A younger lord from a smaller house trembled as he declared, "We have children to protect. We will submit if it means they live." The hall descended into chaos once more. Sansa attempted to restore order, but the arguments raged back and forth, harsh and desperate. Jon felt the weight of the Night King's silent presence in his mind, urging a resolution. He closed his eyes, remembering the heartbreak in Daenerys' voice, the betrayal in Tormund's eyes, the war that he was meant to end. Perhaps he had damned them all by even offering this choice. Suddenly, the roar of a dragon echoed overhead, rattling the rafters. The great hall's doors slammed open again. Daenerys returned, clad in battle leathers this time, fury in her eyes. Around her, a cadre of Dothraki and Unsullied bristled with lethal intent. Sansa stiffened, and the lords turned, alarmed. Jon felt his heart pound. Daenerys strode into the midst of the chaos, holding herself like a queen. "I have heard enough of this madness. If you will not stand against the Night King, I will." She swept her gaze across the assembly. "Who among you stands with me?" A number of men, including some from the north, found themselves inspired by her resolve. They pressed forward, shouting that they would fight to the last man. Others remained uncertain or fearful. The rift became physical as Daenerys' supporters clustered around her, while those too frightened or unwilling drifted away. Arya looked between them, her face conflicted. Sansa stood on the dais, torn, because she could not see any path that did not end in death or tyranny. Jon stepped forward, voice ringing. "Daenerys, I beg you, do not do this. He will kill you and your men. Even your dragons can be turned if they fall." She aimed a glare at him, heartbreak mingled with scorn. "I have faced impossible odds before. I will not abandon the living to the darkness of that creature. If we fail, we fail, but we will have fought with honor." Jon tried to speak again, but found no words that could sway her. She turned away, addressing the lords who had rallied to her. "We march at dawn for the Shivering Sea. My scouts report the Whites have paused their advance north of the Broken Wall. We will take Drogon and Rhaegal, strike from the sky, burn as many as we can. Let every man who has the courage to fight join me." Roars of assent answered her. Sansa, trembling, said, "Daenerys, wait. If you do this, you condemn the rest of us." Daenerys silenced her with a fierce look. "I condemn no one. I offer a choice. Fight for your freedom or kneel to that horror. I choose to fight." In the hush that followed, more and more men broke away from the crowd to side with the Dragon Queen. The tension nearly broke into violence right there in the Great Hall, but Sansa managed to keep the peace with desperate pleas. When at last the dust settled, nearly half of the knights and lords in attendance had pledged to ride with Daenerys. The others stood aside, some quietly leaning toward submission, others so uncertain they could scarcely move. Arya lingered, her eyes locked on Jon's. For a moment it seemed she would walk to Daenerys. Then she turned away, stepping toward Sansa. "I won't leave you," she said softly, "but I won't kneel either." Conflict tore at Sansa's features, but she addressed Daenerys. "I cannot in good conscience lead my people into a war we cannot win. We've lost too many already. If the Night King truly gives us a chance to live, as monstrous as it is, I must consider it." Daenerys' lips parted in disbelief. "Then you are lost to me," she said, voice quavering. She turned and strode out, her loyalists following in a noisy exodus that left the Great Hall feeling gutted and cold. The aftermath was a swirl of arguments, tears, and outbursts of anger. Some families were divided between those who wished to fight and those who would submit. Sansa did her best to hold the assembly together, but the cracks were too deep. Eventually, she dismissed everyone, instructing them to prepare for departure if they had chosen Daenerys' path or to remain at Winterfell if they would heed Jon's call. Jon himself stood numbly by, feeling as if he were an observer to the fracturing of the realm. In the days that followed, a grim exodus occurred. Daenerys and her supporters mustered supplies, horses, and weapons. The two remaining dragons perched outside Winterfell, growling and stirring the air with blasts of scorching breath. The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut with a dagger. Jon and Daenerys exchanged no more words after that final confrontation in the hall. He saw her only once, from a distance, as she mounted Drogon and took flight. The ache in his chest felt like a mortal wound. Sansa remained, trying to calm the northern lords who refused to fight. Arya was furious, pacing the battlements like a caged wolf. Bran alone seemed serene, though Jon sometimes thought he caught a flicker of sadness in his younger brother's distant gaze. Everyone understood that soon the line between life and death would be determined by Daenerys' assault. If she somehow prevailed, the threat would be ended. If she failed, the Night King would come, and those who remained in Winterfell would be forced to kneel or die. On the morning Daenerys' host departed, the sky was the color of slate. A biting wind swept across the courtyard. Jon stood on the ramparts, watching the procession of Unsullied, Dothraki, and Northern Knights who had chosen to follow her banner. They marched with a fierce sense of purpose, a final stand in the face of annihilation. The dragons wheeled overhead, their roars echoing across the chill air. Davos approached Jon, adjusting the thick gloves on his hands. He looked at the departing host with a forlorn expression. "So it comes to this," he murmured. Jon could not tear his eyes away from the sight. "Yes, they're likely riding into death, aren't they?" Jon inhaled shakily. "They are." The faint presence of the Night King in his mind gave him no illusions. Daenerys had no chance. The Whites were too many, the White Walkers too powerful, the undead dragon unstoppable. The best she could do was slay some portion of the army before she and her dragons fell. Even that might be too hopeful. Davos sighed. "I can't blame them for trying. We're not meant to live under such a force. But I also can't blame those who choose to submit. It's a tragedy either way." He turned to Jon, his old eyes searching. "What will you do now?" Jon leaned on the parapet, longing for the old, simpler times when the only enemies were men and their cruelty. "I must see this through, Davos. If Daenerys fails, the Night King will expect me to hold the rest in check. I swore it." Davos lowered his gaze. "And if any refuse to kneel, you will?" Jon closed his eyes. "I must." Davos didn't protest. He merely placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "I wish there was another way, lad." Jon nodded, tears stinging behind his eyelids. "So do I." They watched until Daenerys' forces disappeared over the horizon, swallowed by the bleak northern wilderness. The future seemed to teeter on a knife's edge. Either that valiant army would succeed in doing the impossible, or it would vanish beneath the avalanche of undeath. And Jon would be left to pick up the pieces, forging a kingdom under the yoke of the Night King. The days that followed were an agony of waiting. The tension in Winterfell was stifling. Sansa locked herself in her chambers, emerging only to attend to her duties. Arya prowled the corridors, her frustration simmering like a slow boil. Some minor lords departed south, hoping perhaps to avoid the conflict altogether. Jon felt the Night King's presence daily, a quiet, insistent reminder that time was running out. He found himself pacing the Godswood at night, wanting to pray to the old gods but uncertain if they listened anymore. Sometimes he caught sight of Bran, silent under the weirwood, eyes rolled back as he wandered in visions. Jon never disturbed him. On the 7th day, the ravens came. They arrived at dawn, circling Winterfell in a dark cloud. The message they carried, or perhaps the sense of it that Bran gleaned through his warging, was devastating. Daenerys' army had been annihilated at the fist of the First Men. Only a handful of survivors managed to flee, scattering across the tundra. The dragons had burned tens of thousands of Whites, but the White Walkers' onslaught, aided by the undead dragon, was too great. Drogon and Rhaegal had fallen from the sky, one after the other, wounded by the Night King's spears of ice. Both had been razed, becoming twisted shadows of their former might. Thus ended Daenerys Stormborn's final campaign. Along with it perished the bulk of the living's last major fighting force. It was over. When Sansa announced this in the Great Hall, a hush more absolute than any before fell upon the assembled courtiers. Despair radiated through them. Some openly wept, others stood grim and silent. It was only a matter of time before the dead marched south again. And now they had 2 more dragons in their undead ranks. Amidst that oppressive gloom, Jon rose and said quietly, "We must kneel." His words cut through the hall. If we do not, we will share Daenerys's fate." He paused, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "I am sorry for what happened, but now there is no other hope. The Night King will come, and if we resist, we will all die." Some in the hall looked ready to resist anyway, tears of anger streaking their faces. Others looked defeated, their eyes hollow. Sansa, pale as a ghost, nodded once. "Summon the lords, the knights, and the people," she told her stewards. "We will make a formal submission tomorrow at dawn." Jon closed his eyes. It felt as if a part of him died at those words, but another part, the cold presence he shared with the Night King, stirred in bleak satisfaction. That night he wandered the castle. He came upon Ghost in the courtyard, the dire wolf gazing at him with mournful eyes. Ghost let out a low whine, as if uncertain whether Jon was truly himself. Jon knelt and ruffled Ghost's fur, tears slipping down his cheeks. The wolf pressed its nose into his palm, acknowledging him despite the cold. "I'm so sorry," Jon whispered. He didn't know if it was to Ghost or the Starks or the memory of Daenerys. Eventually, he left the courtyard and found himself drawn to the Godswood. The old weirwood tree stood silent, its face carved with sorrow. Snow fell in soft flakes. Bran was there, waiting in his chair. His eyes were focused on the red leaves overhead. Jon approached hesitantly. "Bran." Bran's voice was distant, echoing with the knowledge of countless timelines. "They are nearly upon us. The Night King rides the undead dragon, leading an army larger than ever." Jon's heart clenched. "I know." Bran turned his head, his gaze meeting Jon's. "I've seen you in many visions, Jon. In some, you lead the people through the long night, forging a new kingdom under ice. In others, you defy the Night King in the end, choosing death over servitude. The future remains uncertain, even now." Jon swallowed hard, a swirl of conflicting emotions warring within him. "I made a promise," he whispered. "If I break it, the war resumes. Everyone dies." Bran studied him, eyes endless. "Sometimes, the only way to break a cycle is to face the darkness, even if it destroys you." Jon let out a ragged breath. "If I do that, we lose everything. The living will stand no chance." Bran nodded. "Yes, but consider this. Even if the living survive under the Night King's rule, is that truly living? Or is it a slower death, the extinguishing of hope across generations?" Jon stared at the weirwood's carved face. He felt tears welling up. "I don't know. I don't know what to do, Bran." The weight of the entire realm seemed to crush him. "I only wanted to save them. I only wanted to stop the killing." Bran's voice was gentle, though tinged with sorrow. "Some wars are meant to be fought no matter the cost. Peace that is won through utter surrender may not be peace at all." Jon felt hollow. He bowed his head, his tears dripping onto the snowy ground. "Tomorrow, all of Winterfell will kneel. The lords will follow or flee, but eventually, the whole North must bow or die." He wiped at his eyes. "That is the new world." Bran offered no comfort, only a quiet presence. The wind rustled the leaves overhead. Ghost's distant howl echoed in the courtyard. Jon stood there for a long time, wrestling with his conscience, the Night King's bond humming like ice in his veins. Morning came shrouded in pale, feeble sunlight. The entire population of Winterfell, lords, commoners, soldiers, gathered in the vast courtyard. Word had spread, and many from neighboring lands had arrived seeking shelter, only to learn that submission was the cost of safety. The tension was nearly unbearable. Sansa stood in front, flanked by Arya and Bran, along with the leading lords who had chosen to remain. Jon waited beside them, feeling as though he was about to witness an execution. A horn blast echoed across the frosty air. Then another. On the walls, watchers shouted, fear in their voices. The undead had arrived, overshadowing the horizon, their ranks filling the fields beyond Winterfell. 3 undead dragons circled in the sky, spewing icy breath that stung the face of the earth. At their head flew the Night King, now with Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal enslaved to his cold will. their once majestic scales marred by frost and decay. It was a sight to drive the bravest hearts to despair. The drawbridge lowered. Winterfell's gates creaked open. Out marched Jon, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and the lords. Every step was like walking to a funeral. They crossed the open ground, halting a short distance from the vanguard of the Whites. An entire sea of them stretched behind, silent, eyes glowing blue. The dragons landed with thunderous impact, shaking the earth. Winds whipped the banners on Winterfell's walls. Screams and gasps fluttered through the ranks of the living as they beheld the monstrous forms. Then the Night King dropped from Drogon's back. He strode forward, tall and inhuman, his eyes fixed on Jon. Jon felt the cold bond intensify, the mental voice swirling in his mind. "You have done as commanded." Jon nodded, trying to steady himself. "They will kneel." The Night King said nothing aloud. He did not need to. He lifted one hand, beckoning the living to make their submission. Sansa stepped forward first, each movement painfully slow. Her face was ashen, tears threatening to spill, but her voice carried resolute calm. "On behalf of House Stark and the people of the North," she said, trembling, "we bend the knee." And with those words, she sank to the ground. Arya looked like she wanted to scream or lunge at the Night King. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. But she glanced at Sansa, at Bran, at Jon, and closed her eyes. Slowly, she knelt. One by one, the lords followed, tears and rage in their eyes, but powerless. A wave of submission passed through the living until all were on their knees. Bran remained in his chair, though he bowed his head. It was the visual oath. The North bowed to the ancient enemy of mankind. Jon knelt last, closing his eyes as he did so, and in that moment, the hush of the undead army was absolute. The coldness of the Night King's presence enveloped him, a sense of triumphant finality. He had succeeded. The living were brought to heel. There would be no more war, no more additions to the army of the dead, unless someone defied him. The Night King turned, scanning the kneeling crowd. His expression was as impassive as ice, but Jon felt a flicker of grim satisfaction passing through him. The terrifying hush lasted for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, the Night King lifted his arms. Everyone stiffened, fearing the worst, that he would raise them to join the dead. But no, the gesture was not one of violence. The swirling wind calmed, and the watchers on Winterfell's walls observed as the dead parted ranks, opening a path. The Night King turned back to Jon, his silent message clear. "You will rule them in my stead." Jon rose on shaking legs. He swallowed, dread swirling inside him. This was the peace he had bargained for. The living would breathe, but they would never be free. Tension radiated from the people around him. Sansa rose, wiping tears from her face. Arya stared at the ground, her fists still clenched, as though she might leap up and fight at any moment. Bran merely observed, as if seeing 1,000 branching futures. The Night King gestured to the broken horizon, as if commanding Jon to march south. "Spread the submission. End all resistance. The war is over if they yield." Jon understood. This was only the beginning. He would have to travel to other realms. The Riverlands, the Vale, the Crownlands, even to King's Landing. He would have to make them kneel by fear or persuasion, all in the name of preventing a cataclysmic slaughter. Tears burned in his eyes as he realized the magnitude of the role he had accepted. He would become a symbol of capitulation to an inhuman power. He would be seen as the great betrayer of humankind by those who still might resist. Yet, if he faltered, the slaughter would resume, a horrifying noose around his neck, with every life in the Seven Kingdoms as collateral. He closed his eyes, remembering Daenerys' fierce gaze, Tormund's defiance, the words of his father, Ned Stark, who had always chosen honor above survival. He felt the cold within him, the presence of the Night King. The hush was deafening. When he opened his eyes, he found Sansa's gaze locked on him. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, a single tear tracing down her cheek. He realized that in her eyes, he was lost to them. Arya refused to look at him, her jaw rigid. Jon took a step forward, turning to address the kneeling crowd of Winterfell, though he spoke loudly enough for the Night King to hear. From this day forward, we live under a new order. We will not be slaughtered. We will not be raised as whites, but we must obey. This is the price of survival. His words fell like a death knell over the courtyard. The living exhaled a collective sob, even as the whites stood motionless, waiting for their master's will. The two undead dragons behind the Night King shifted restlessly, frost swirling from their nostrils. In the distance, the plains that once led to the shattered wall were quiet, no more war horns sounding. Jon turned to the Night King, meeting those frozen blue eyes. He bowed his head. The deal was sealed, and so began the reign of the long peace. Peace tinged with dread, where every living soul waited in the shadow of the others, never knowing if a single spark of rebellion might reignite the onslaught of the dead. The land lay quiet, enslaved by fear. Jon Snow, bound by a vow of ice, led them into that bitter dawn, carrying on his shoulders the scorn of those who would rather die free than live in chains. In the recesses of his mind, a flicker of warmth, a memory of better days, fought to remain. But it was soon drowned beneath the hush of the endless winter that whispered, "All men must serve." And so the world breathed, precariously alive, while the winds of the north howled in silent vigil over a peace as cold as death. Over the next few days following the kneeling of Winterfell, not much changed on the surface of daily life. The winter wind still swept the courtyards, men still slept and woke and tended to chores, and the ravens still came and went. But a subtle, suffocating pall had fallen over the castle and its surrounding lands. The knowledge that the Night King's inexhaustible horde loomed just beyond the walls, kept only in check by the vow Jon Snow had given, lodged like a splinter in every heart. At any moment, the undead might march forward if Jon's oath failed, and if that happened, no sword nor fire nor living army would hold them back again. Sansa Stark stood at dawn on the battlements, looking across the snow-shrouded landscape. A thin drizzle of sleet scratched against the walls, layering the ramparts with ice. The farmland beyond, once coated in new-fallen white, was now trampled by the passing of thousands of feet. The Night King had withdrawn his host a short distance, just enough for Winterfell's inhabitants to see the shimmering line of whites on the horizon, a silent threat in every sense. She could spot, even through the hazy dawn, the silhouettes of those monstrous undead dragons perched among the ranks of the fallen. Their presence made the morning sun look feeble in comparison, as though no warmth could truly reach this land anymore. She heard boots crunch in the snow behind her. Jon approached, cloaked in black furs that somehow seemed darker than the day he returned. A hush fell between them. They had not spoken intimately since the moment he led the people of Winterfell to kneel. That moment had shattered much of their old understanding. Sansa could barely look him in the eye, yet she felt it was her duty, as Lady of Winterfell, to bear the weight of what came next. She drew a breath, forcing herself not to tremble in the icy wind. "They haven't moved all night," Sansa said quietly, keeping her gaze on the horizon. She had scarcely slept, haunted by nightmares of white ambushes or swirling storms of ice. It was a bitterness, after all that had happened, that this hush might be the only reprieve they were permitted. Jon nodded. "They won't move unless we give them cause." His voice was quiet, but it carried that new note of resignation and tension that had lodged in him. "I can feel it, Sansa. The Night King is waiting." She turned her head toward him, face pale, cheeks stung by the wind. "Waiting for what?" "For me to do what I promised," Jon said. "Bring the rest of the realm to heel. He wants the north secured first. He wants each stronghold, each domain, to swear fealty or else face annihilation. Then he wants that repeated in the south, until there's no corner of Westeros left unbent." Sansa's eyes flickered with pain. "And how do you propose to do that?" Jon did not answer right away. He looked out at the horizon, at the flicker of unearthly blue eyes in the distance. "I have to leave Winterfell," he said at last. "Take a contingent of men who recognize my authority. I'll have to travel from keep to keep, Present the same choice I gave here. Kneel or face the dead. A swift pang of fear cut through Sansa. You think they'll accept you? Or that you'll be welcomed after all this? Jon's mouth tightened. No. They'll see me as a traitor if they don't already. Some might recall me as the king in the north, or the bastard of Winterfell who once brought them victory against Ramsay Bolton. But after we bowed to the Night King, they'll see me as the man who knelt to a demon. Many will likely resist, but the more they resist, the more brutal the outcome. He closed his eyes for a second. I have to persuade them there is no other way. Sansa looked down at the frost clinging to the crenellations. And what if they don't believe you? She thought of House Glover, House Serwyn, House Manderly. Some of them had parted from Winterfell in the days leading up to the final confrontation with the dead. They might still be holding out somewhere, or else they had joined Daenerys and perished on the fist of the First Men. Others might have gone to the western coasts, or to the Riverlands, hoping for some miracle. None of them had expected this outcome. Jon's voice was low. Then they die, and in dying they become part of his army. The next fortress falls even more easily. He exhaled, his breath forming a white plume. I can't allow that, Sansa. So I have to make them kneel, for their own sakes. A swirl of conflicting emotions twisted in her gut. Anger at him for forging such a monstrous bargain, pity for him for bearing this vile burden, and sorrow for what had been lost. You realize what they'll call you, Jon? His eyes cast downward. They'll call me a monster, an abomination, the Night King's thrall. He paused. Maybe that's exactly what I am. Sansa wanted to say he wasn't, but a piece of her could not muster the lie. She let the silence speak, and the wind howled around them. From the far side of the courtyard, a horn sounded, indicating the gates were about to open. She turned. I should go. I have responsibilities here. Jon nodded, though the flicker of longing in his eyes pained her. And I have mine, he said quietly. I'll be leaving within the day. I need you to keep Winterfell stable while I'm gone. Don't let the people revolt, or do anything that might bring the Whites down on us. Sansa only nodded, lips tight. A rebellious part of her yearned to scream that she was not his jailer, nor was she the jailer of her own people. But she swallowed it. I'll do what I must. He bowed his head, turned, and walked away. He left a swirl of footprints in the frosty rampart behind him. Sansa stared after him for a long time, then dragged herself down the stairs. Winterfell, and the entire North, needed her composure, even if her heart was in turmoil. She found that many of the lords who had chosen to stay after the submission had fallen into a state of sullen acceptance. They moved about their daily duties with a grim, haggard efficiency. No one spoke openly of hope. The White Walkers, now in possession of 3 undead dragons, seemed beyond mortal reckoning. And with Daenerys' defeat, who else could champion the living? Tormund Giantsbane and the Free Folk had fled southward, to places unknown. Most likely, they were scattered across the wilds, refusing to kneel, yet doomed to be hunted when the White Walkers swept down. Every day, more refugees arrived outside Winterfell's gates, trembling at the sight of the Whites stationed a league away, but seeking any crumb of safety. Sansa let them in if she could. The alternative was to condemn them to frostbite or to the dead. Late that afternoon, in the library tower, Arya confronted her. Arya's hair hung limp, her dark clothing and cloak dusty from too many restless hours spent on the walls or stalking around the training yard. Her expression was taut with fury, that repressed anger that had been building since Jon returned. She stood by a table covered in old tomes about the Long Night, half-ripped pages describing ancient battles and the children of the forest. But no knowledge in those brittle scrolls offered a solution to their predicament. I'm going with him, Arya stated, arms crossed. Sansa paused in shelving a book, turning. With Jon? Why? Arya's tone was sharp. Because I won't let him march through the north unchecked. Who knows what he'll do in the Night King's name? I won't let him become the monster everyone fears. Sansa looked at her younger sister, seeing the lines of tension that made her look older than her years. How do you plan to stop him, Arya? I don't know, Arya snapped. But I'm not staying here to watch our people cower behind the walls, waiting to see if the White Walkers murder us tomorrow or next week. I'd rather do something. Sansa set the book on a shelf. She tried to keep her voice calm, though the heartbreak in her chest was fierce. You can't kill the Night King. We know that. And if you raise a hand against Jon, or if you stir up a rebellion, the dead will come. And you'll doom us all. Arya's jaw clenched. So we do nothing? Sit here, waiting for scraps of news from him while he goes around bending all the other lords to that thing. It's not nothing. It's keeping Winterfell alive, Sansa said, though the words tasted bitter. You know the penalty if we cross him. We agreed to this. It's the only way to protect the small folk from being turned. Arya glared at her, a swirl of conflicting emotions behind her gray eyes. I can't just stand by. I have to see this for myself. Then her expression softened, a quiet undercurrent of sorrow slipping through. He's still our brother. I have to know if there's something left of the man we loved under that coldness. Sansa closed her eyes for a beat. He's leaving at sundown, maybe sooner. If you ride out and catch him on the road, or if you're at the stables when he departs, I'm sure he won't stop you. He doesn't want hostilities with us. She opened her eyes again, gazing at Arya. Just be careful. Arya nodded, stepping away from the desk. I will. For a moment, she lingered, as if wanting to say something else. Then she settled for a brief, tight hug. Sansa returned it, feeling how small Arya's frame was beneath the bravado. Then Arya broke away and left, footsteps echoing on the stone steps. Sansa stood still, letting the hush of the library enfold her. She was the Lady of Winterfell, but she felt as though she had no real power. Perhaps that had always been the truth, in times of monstrous tyranny. All she could do was preserve her people, and now even that felt precarious. She placed her hand on the old tome in front of her, shutting her eyes, wishing with all her heart for a different solution. Jon departed Winterfell as quietly as he had once left it to seek out parley with the Night King. Only a few men accompanied him, a handful of northern soldiers who still recognized him as their rightful lord, and a few sworn knights who believed there was no other way. They carried banners with the Stark sigil, but with a twist. Upon the field of gray, a single slash of white to symbolize winter's dominion. It was a subtle addition, but it carried the meaning that they now marched under the new order, one that included the others. As they passed through the gate, the sky above was bruised with twilight. Jon had meant to leave at sundown, but a scattering of last-minute details had delayed him. He felt an unease in his gut, as though the presence in his mind, that faint echo of the Night King, was stirring with impatience. The Whites remained a league distant, a ring of watchers. Somewhere among them lurked the White Walkers themselves, perhaps even the Night King on his rotting mount. He had not come to greet Jon in person again, content instead to let Jon enact the mission. They rode out on an old King's Road that stretched south. As expected, the Watchers parted for them. Jon felt no fear passing through that silent mass of Whites. He knew they would not harm him, but the men with him looked pale, eyes darting at the dead. Thousands of milky blue gazes, all fixed in that unholy stare, parted like an ocean of corpses, letting the living pass. Jon suspected no words could describe the horror of it. These men, some grizzled veterans, some younger but stoic, kept their faces stony, but he saw their hands shake on the reins. Just as they cleared that ghastly corridor of Whites, a mounted figure came cantering out of Winterfell's gate behind them. Jon turned to see Arya riding a sleek gray mare, face grim, cloak streaming behind her. She caught up, ignoring the uneasy looks from his companions. Jon slowed his horse, letting her come alongside. "I'm coming with you," she said without preamble. Her tone was final. Jon regarded her for a moment, sadness flickering in his gaze. "Why?" Arya lifted her chin. "I have my reasons." She cast a glance at the men behind them, then back at Jon. "You'd rather I go alone?" He let out a slow breath. Part of him wanted to send her back, to protect her from the horrors to come. But Arya Stark was not a child. "I won't stop you," he said softly. But it's going to be dangerous. A mirthless little laugh escaped her. As if it hasn't been dangerous for years? Jon nodded, conceding the point. He spurred his horse onward, and they rode south, leaving the looming white army behind. The men parted around Arya, some greeting her with respectful nods as she fell into line. An uneasy hush lingered, the memory of that ring of corpses fresh in their minds. They continued for hours under the dim twilight, the days in the north so short that it felt like night was always encroaching. When they stopped to rest the horses, the temperature had dropped even further. The wind blew from the north, carrying a promise of deeper cold. Jon ordered the men to make a small fire in a sheltered hollow, though the wood was damp and the flames sputtered. They sat around it in a weary circle, passing a skin of water mixed with a bit of ale. Arya perched on a log, silent for a while. Her face flickered in the weak light, casting her features in sharp relief. Eventually, she turned to Jon. "Where do we ride first?" Jon rubbed his hands together, letting the feeble warmth seep into his skin. "To House Serwyn, then House Tallheart, and so on. Each holdfast in the north, in a line that leads toward the neck. We'll gather them, see if they'll bend. Once that's done, we move farther south. Moat Cailin, White Harbor, the Riverlands, anywhere we can, all the way to King's Landing." Arya stared at the dying flames. "And if they refuse?" Jon's eyes were bleak. "They won't refuse. Not once I show them the alternative." Arya did not press further. The other men kept their heads down, perhaps hoping this journey was some awful nightmare they would wake from. The fire dimmed, casting them all in gloom. They posted sentries, though Jon doubted any living threat would challenge them. The greatest threat loomed behind them or possibly in front of them, but it was not something they could guard against with watchful eyes alone. Arya dozed fitfully, swords and knives hidden at her side. Jon lay awake, scanning the darkness. He thought of Ghost, left behind in Winterfell. He thought of Sansa, so stoic and frightened. He remembered Daenerys and the broken dreams of freedom from tyranny. Those memories came to him like old wounds that refused to close. And beneath it all was the chilling sense that the Night King was never far from his thoughts, whispering silent commands. Jon could not hear any distinct words, but he felt the impatience, the ancient will urging him onward. The others wanted him to act faster. They wanted dominion over the entire continent, and they had harnessed him as their tool, sealing him to that fate with a bond he found unbreakable. They arrived at Castle Serwyn late on the second day. The holdfast was modest and battered, perched on a slight rise overlooking a frozen river. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and a handful of men stood guard on the walls, though. Ugh, they had few illusions of real protection. Winter had made resources scarce. Daenerys's war with the dead had drawn away most fighting men. The sight of Jon's column approaching, with stark banners marked by Winter's white slash, brought confused murmurs from the guards. The gates stayed shut until Jon demanded entry. After some frantic shouts, the guards recognized him. They opened the gates to let him pass. In the courtyard, a scattering of villagers and servants peered at the riders with mingled relief and alarm. Word had traveled that Winterfell had bowed to an unnatural king. Some had heard only rumors, others refused to believe it. Seeing Jon Snow in the flesh, flanked by armed soldiers and Arya Stark, forced them to confront the truth. Lord Serwyn, a young man with sallow cheeks and a worried brow, emerged to greet them, his voice a quaver. "Lord Snow, your grace." He stumbled over the title, uncertain whether to call Jon king or some other courtesy. "We feared the worst after what happened at the wall." Jon swung down from his horse, ignoring his men's attempts to create a protective circle. No one here was going to threaten him, not openly. He glanced at Arya, who dismounted silently at his side, one hand on the hilt of needle. Her cold stare was enough to quell curiosity from the onlookers. Jon approached Lord Serwyn, voice subdued. "The worst has already happened. If you've not heard, Daenerys Targaryen and her armies fell in battle. The dead hold the north in a stranglehold." He took a breath. "I come with an offer from the Night King. Bend the knee and you will not be harmed. Resist, and you, and everyone here will be destroyed." A ripple of horror spread among the onlookers. Lord Serwyn paled, his lips trembling. You're serious?" His gaze flickered to Arya. "Lady Stark, is this truly?" Arya's voice emerged cool as steel. "Yes, we've seen it ourselves." Winterfell bowed for the sake of survival. Her mouth twisted as she said it, as though the words were bitter. Lord Serwyn looked as though his heart might fail. He shifted on his feet. "And what does kneeling entail? Must we leave our lands, or offer tribute?" Jon nodded grimly. "Tribute in the form of obedience. You must not raise a sword against the Night King or his armies. You must swear upon your honor and your bloodline that you will obey the new order. In exchange, you live. You continue as you have, growing crops, keeping your people alive. But if you ever defy him, you'll face annihilation." He paused. "Kneel, and I will vouch for your loyalty." Serwyn swallowed audibly. Then, slowly, in the courtyard dirt, he knelt. He bowed his head in submission, tears glinting in his eyes. I swear it," he whispered, voice trembling. "For my people, I swear." Behind him, the few guards and servants looked at each other in dismay. One by one, they too sank to the ground, a wave of kneeling forms. Arya looked away, as if the sight scalded her. Jon felt a piece of his soul fray even further. This was how it would go, holdfast by holdfast, until the entire north was subdued. Jon allowed them to rise. "Gather your people," he said quietly. "Let them hear the oath. Any who dissent, who swear they would rather die than kneel, must be sent away at once." He looked toward the castle's modest great hall. "We'll do it inside, properly." Lord Serwyn hastened to carry out the order, relief warring with shame in his eyes. Meanwhile, Jon ordered his men to stable the horses and find lodging. They did so with mechanical efficiency, each man wearing that haunted expression. Arya said nothing, but as soon as there was a moment's lull, she pulled Jon aside. They stood near a well in the courtyard, the wind ruffling their cloaks, carrying the hush of onlookers who kept their distance. "Is this how it's going to be everywhere?" she asked, voice taut. "We show up, threaten them with a fate worse than death, and watch them grovel?" Jon's jaw tightened. "Yes." She stared at him for a heartbeat. "And you're content with that?" A flash of anger lit Jon's eyes. "Content? Do you think this is some twisted satisfaction for me, Arya? To threaten my own people? I hate this, but what else can I do? If they don't bend, the Night King marches. I'd be forced to watch them become whites." His voice cracked. "Is that better?" Arya studied him, then turned away, arms folded. "There's no answer that's better," she said with a certain bitterness. "They're both nightmares." Jon ran a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the road and the sting of the cold. "Yes, they are." He lifted his head, voice quiet. "If you're going to follow me, understand that this is what you'll see. Over and over." She gave a single nod, lips set in a firm line. "Then let's get on with it." They walked into the keep's great hall. There, by torchlight, Lord Serwyn and his folk knelt again. They spoke the words of fealty, not to Jon Snow specifically, but to the new order. Jon listened with a grim set to his features, reciting the lines that had been hammered into his mind by the very knowledge of what would happen otherwise. "You swear never to raise arms against the Night King or his servants," Jon said, voice echoing off the wooden rafters. "You swear to remain loyal, to pay heed if called upon, to enforce peace among your people. You swear it before the old gods, the Seven, or any god you hold dear." Lord Serwyn repeated it, tears in his throat. His people followed suit, their vow echoing in the flickering gloom. Arya stood to one side, stiff and silent, watching the scene with haunted eyes. When it was done, Jon nodded gravely. "The dead will not march here, so long as you keep this vow." A wave of tense relief rolled through the crowd. Some wept openly, others slumped in despair. The relief was overshadowed by the knowledge that they had just traded freedom for the thinnest promise of continued life. Lord Serwyn approached Jon afterward, voice low. Will they come to garrison us? The White Walkers. No, Jon tried to keep his voice from wavering. They have no interest in occupying your castle. They have no reason to remain here if you abide by your vow. Serwyn let out a shaky breath, then bowed. Then I thank you. My father and grandfather served House Stark, and I will do the same in this new reality. Jon managed a nod, turning away before the man could see the sorrow in his eyes. He felt Arya's presence at his shoulder, silent and grim. Lord Serwyn invited them to stay the night, offering a meager supper, but Jon refused. He wanted to press on. The faster he swept through these holdfasts, the less likely any of them would try to fight back. If a rebellion started somewhere, the Night King would sense it, and that would be the end of any illusions of mercy. They departed Castle Serwyn under the moonlight. The men moved like ghosts along the road. Their torches flickered in the dark, forming a line of bobbing lights. The track ahead led to the next holdfast, and the next, a chain of submissions that would continue until the entire north lay flat on its belly. Arya asked no more questions as they rode. Jon's men said little, though their tension was palpable. Each time Jon glanced at Arya, her face looked carved from granite. In the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself across the north. At each keep, the arrival of Jon Snow and Arya Stark, one a figure of fearsome rumor, the other a Stark famed for her lethal skill, stirred a commotion. Some tried to bar the gates, but when Jon threatened them with the unstoppable might of the dead, they relented. Others welcomed them in, already resigned to the new order. A few considered open defiance, but the rumor of the White Walkers' unstoppable armies, combined with the memory of how quickly Daenerys had fallen, proved more persuasive than any sword. In place after place, Jon listened to the vows of lords and ladies bending the knee. Some pleaded for more leniency. Some tried to offer gold or goods, as if appeasing a normal ruler. But Jon refused all bribes. Tribute, he said, was irrelevant to the dead. The only currency they recognized was submission. And so the North capitulated. The old alliances that Jon Snow had painstakingly built when he became king in the North were put to a final test, and they crumbled. Many men wept, cursing Jon's name even as they vowed to kneel. Others spat at his feet, hurling insults before lowering themselves to the floor. Jon endured it all in stony silence, unwavering and haunted. Each success carried that frigid sense of approval from the Night King. Jon felt it in his dreams, in the edges of his waking hours. A swirl of cold validation, as though the ancient force recognized his puppet was performing well. Sometimes, Jon found himself wondering what would happen if he simply turned around and marched his men in open revolt. But that was an impossible fantasy. The White Walkers would come. The undead dragons would melt any fortress walls with that awful cold fire they spewed, and the entire region would be transformed into a land of corpses. He carried that knowledge like a leaden weight. Arya witnessed everything. She was with Jon when a small group of bannermen actually tried to ambush him in a pine forest near Torrhen Square. They had concealed themselves among the trees, believing they could slay Jon and cause the living to rally. But Arya sensed the trap. She'd grown adept at reading signs in the wilderness. She quietly told Jon, who ordered his men to halt. A tense standoff ended in a volley of arrows from the rebels, wounding 2 of Jon's riders. Arya vanished into the gloom, as quick and silent as a shadow. The next thing Jon saw was Arya returning with blood on her blade. The would-be rebels lay dead among the pines. Not one had been left alive. "They gave me no choice," Arya said, her voice devoid of emotion, though her eyes shimmered with suppressed rage at what it had come to. Better to kill them quietly than let them try to start a real war. Jon stared at the blood. Another handful of good men, once loyal to House Stark, now lost. He put a hand on Arya's shoulder, though she shook it off. He said nothing, for he had no words left that could lessen the horror. They carried on, forging their path deeper south, day by day. The nights grew somewhat longer, the daytime light somewhat brighter, but the cold was relentless. It was as if an unending winter had truly settled on the land. Each time they paused, Jon scanned the northern horizon, half expecting the Night King's legions to appear in silent vigil. But the undead army remained near the wall and Winterfell, at least for the moment. As news spread of Jon's approach, some lesser lords simply fled. They abandoned their keeps, taking families and small folk and leading them east or west, hoping to find some corner of the realm that might stand against the dead. Others tried to buy time, stalling in hope that the rumored Iron Islands or Dorne would unite in defiance. Rumors abounded that Yara Greyjoy was in the Narrow Sea with a fleet, or that a new Targaryen cousin had emerged somewhere in Essos with a legion of sellswords. Every rumor, however, was merely a rumor. No new armies arrived. No dragons soared across the sky to challenge the dread power of the Night King's 3 undead beasts. There was no salvation on the horizon, and with each castle's capitulation, the living spirit of resistance dimmed. Eventually, Jon and his company reached White Harbor, the greatest city in the north. Its shining towers and port, once bustling, were now choked with ice-laden ships moored in the harbor, waiting out the winter. Many refugees from scattered villages had crammed inside the city walls, seeking some last bastion of normalcy. But as Jon rode across the causeway, flanked by Arya and 100 grim soldiers, the city gates swung open without resistance. Lord Manderly stood ready at the docks, flanked by his own knights, to greet them. Lord Manderly had once been a staunch supporter of Jon's claim as king in the north. He had pledged men to fight at the Battle of the Bastards and had later recognized Jon's leadership wholeheartedly. Now his face was gray with sorrow, his once healthy girth reduced somewhat by stress, but he extended a formal welcome. He introduced his daughter and grandsons, all of whom looked fearful. The rumor that Jon traveled in the Night King's name preceded him everywhere. Even those who might have once called him an ally now treated him like a cursed messenger. In the grand hall of the Merman's Court, beneath carved pillars shaped like sea creatures, Jon repeated the same ultimatum. Lord Manderly, his voice trembling, knelt and offered his fealty. He asked only for time to evacuate some of his people who wished to sail away. Jon said they were free to do so, though there was nowhere truly safe. The Night King's domain extended to the seas as well. The Whites had no need to breathe. Still, Jon had no interest in forcibly imprisoning them. If they wished to risk the waves in midwinter, that was their choice. While the ceremony took place, Arya slipped away, wandering the corridors. She found her way to a high balcony overlooking the harbor, the cold sea wind catching her hair. From there, she could see the tall masts of ships coated in frost, gulls swooping overhead in search of scraps. The city was subdued, the markets half empty, the streets thick with a hush that reminded her uncomfortably of the white armies. She leaned on the stone railing, lost in dark thoughts. She heard quiet footsteps behind her. She tensed out of habit, hand drifting toward her dagger. But it was one of Jon's soldiers, a man named Torrhen, if she recalled, though she hadn't spoken to him much. He wore furs that did little to hide the hollows in his cheeks. He stepped forward and bowed slightly. "Lady Arya," he said, keeping his voice low. "I hope you don't think me out of line, but I wanted to speak to you." Arya studied him. He was tall, slightly stooped, with a scar over one eye. She did not sense hostility, only caution. "Go on," she said. He gazed at the harbor. "Many of us followed Jon Snow because we believed in him. We believed in House Stark. But this alliance with that thing out there," he shuddered. "Some of the men can't stomach it. They speak of deserting or trying to mount a rebellion. But we know what would happen if we did. We've all seen what the Whites can do." He swallowed. "We also know you could kill us for even thinking it." Arya kept her voice steady, though inside, her heart twisted. "What are you asking?" He hesitated. "We wonder if there's any plan, any chance that someone close to Jon might stop this. Not by open rebellion, but maybe by—" Arya stiffened. "You mean kill Jon?" He flinched. "Or break the bond with the Night King somehow. I don't know. We're soldiers, Lady Arya, not sorcerers. We don't understand these things. But we can't keep riding from castle to castle, forcing people to kneel like this. Even if it's the only way to save them from a worse fate, It feels like we're all rotting inside." Arya looked out at the harbor, the black water bobbing with half-frozen vessels. "I don't know if there is a way," she said, voice tight. "Jon's bond with the Night King. He made that choice to save all of us. Breaking it might be impossible." The man's face fell. "Then we're doomed to live under a new tyranny." A heavy silence passed. He bowed again. "Forgive me, Lady Arya. I just had to ask." She watched him go, feeling tension coil in her stomach. He was right. The men were losing hope. Even she was losing hope. After weeks of traveling, watching the same nightmare play out, her own mind churned with despair. She recalled a conversation with Bran just before she left Winterfell. Bran had said, "Sometimes, the only way to break a cycle is to face the darkness, even if it destroys you." She didn't know what that meant. Was there some hidden path she needed to see? She remained on the balcony until Jon found her. He stepped out into the cold wind, standing by her side, gaze drifting across the dark horizon. She felt the gloom radiating from him, an unspoken apology in the set of his shoulders. "We leave in the morning," Jon said. "Lord Manderley has submitted. The city is ours." Arya's jaw clenched. "All right." Jon let the silence stretch. Then he spoke in a halting voice. "You think I'm damned for this, don't you?" Arya didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I think we're all damned, but you're the one who made the deal." He bowed his head. "Yes." After a moment, he stepped away, heading back into the corridor, leaving Arya alone beneath the darkening sky. The forced capitulation of White Harbor marked the final major submission in the north. Those who refused had already fled or been slain. With the region under the new order, Jon's path led south. The crossing at Moat Cailin, a once crucial choke point, proved effortless. Whoever might have been garrisoned there had deserted, leaving only a few desperate families cowering in old towers. They swore loyalty without protest, hollow-eyed and hungry. Beyond Moat Cailin stretched the Neck and the Swamplands, seat of House Reed. The Crannogmen were elusive folk who seldom bowed to any overlord, even the Starks, without a measure of autonomy. As Jon's company navigated the bogs, they encountered cunningly placed traps, quicksand pits, hidden spike trenches, that took a toll on morale. More than one soldier was lost to the swamp, dragged beneath the muck, never to be seen again. At night, strange calls echoed among the reeds, and the men grew jumpy. Arya, scouting ahead, warned that hidden watchers might be trailing them at all times. Finally, they reached the swampland stronghold known as Greywater Watch, except that it was nowhere to be found in its expected location. Rumor held that the castle shifted, never in the same place twice. For days, they wandered half-lost in the bogs, until they discovered a small settlement of Crannogmen huts perched on stilts. Jon approached cautiously, half expecting an ambush, but instead, an old man with reed-woven armor emerged from the huts. He bore no visible weapons. His name was not given, but he claimed to speak for Lord Howland Reed. "Lord Reed knows why you've come," the old Crannogman said, voice soft but firm. "He knows of the dead that walk. He fought beside your father, Eddard Stark, at the Tower of Joy. He remembers old oaths. He also knows the price of refusing your ultimatum." Jon, weary from the mire, nodded. "Then he knows what must be done. We have no choice." The Crannogman studied him with bright eyes. "He will submit if that is the only path. But if he does, the swamps will open to your enemies as well, and that means the White Walkers can reach us anytime they wish." Arya, who stood next to Jon, bristled at the mention of the White Walkers being their allies, but she remained silent. Jon replied, "Yes, so long as you keep faith, the White Walkers will not harm you." The Crannogman's face seemed carved from driftwood. "They need only decide otherwise, and we can't stop them. Submission will not preserve us forever." Jon had no comforting words. "If you know another way, tell me." A hush hung over the swamp. Frogs croaked in the distance, and the wet air clung to them like a shroud. The Crannogman finally bowed his head. "I'll take your message to Lord Reed. He will not resist." But he asks only that you remember the vow your father once made to him, that House Stark is not an oppressor. We have no illusions now, but perhaps that memory holds some mercy." Jon felt an ache in his chest. He thought of Ned Stark, who had tried to live an honorable life. If Ned saw what Jon was doing now, would he condemn him, or would he understand? Jon had no answer. "We remember," he said simply. The Crannogmen retreated. They waited, making camp on a sparse patch of drier land. Early the next morning, the old man returned, accompanied by a handful of silent watchers. He announced that Lord Reed accepted the new order, under grave protest. The old man added, voice calm, "But will not stand in the way. The bog is yours to pass." Jon bowed his head. "I thank you," even though gratitude felt hollow in his mouth. "We'll trouble you no further." They pressed on, aided by the Crannogmen, who showed them a safer route south. The watchers guided them to the edge of the neck, where more solid ground emerged. The old man parted from them there, fading back into the dense swamp. Arya watched him vanish, an uneasy feeling gnawing at her. She couldn't shake the sense that the Crannogmen had gleaned more about their plight than they revealed. But time pressed on, and they had a mission. They could not linger. Once clear of the swamps, they reached a point where the road forked. One path led into the Riverlands, the other meandered toward the Vale. Unsure of the best direction, Jon decided to push on through the Riverlands first. The Vale, he reasoned, might be harder to approach due to the mountainous terrain and the Aerys' near-impregnable design. He also recalled that Sansa had once had an alliance with the Vale Lords, though how that alliance fared under this new tyranny was uncertain. Perhaps later he would deal with the Vale or send envoys if that was simpler. Thus, they moved southward, traveling through a countryside ravaged by the chaotic wars of the past few years. They passed burned farms, deserted hamlets, and fields sown with corpses, relics from older conflicts. The living had consolidated in bigger strongholds, leaving the outlying lands as ghost regions. Winter's grip had hammered the land as well, freezing rivers and withering crops. Jon wondered how many people had died just from starvation or disease in the last winter, let alone the countless battles. And all for what? In the end, the unstoppable onslaught of the dead overshadowed every petty squabble. Their first major stop in the Riverlands was Harrenhal, that vast and crumbling fortress rumored to be cursed. Smoke rose from within, indicating it was occupied. As Jon's party approached, they saw battered banners, those of House Lannister, repurposed by some band of Sellswords, or so it seemed. Once up close, the gates swung open, and a group of rough-looking mercenaries emerged. Their leader introduced himself as Ser Jason Bywater, a hedge knight in service to no official lord, but rather the current occupant of Harrenhal. That occupant was a figure from the war-littered past, Edmure Tully, once the Lord of Riverrun. He had apparently been released from captivity sometime after the Freys fell, but with no true castle of his own, he had found a precarious refuge in Harrenhal. Jon and Arya exchanged a look when they heard Edmure Tully's name. He was family to them on Catelyn Stark's side, but they had little direct contact with him in recent years. They accepted the invitation to enter, hoping to keep any negotiations civil. Within those blackened, melted towers, they saw how desperate the inhabitants were. Harrenhal's sheer scale made it impossible to maintain fully. Most of its wings lay empty, haunted by echoes. The people who dwelt there crammed into a few less ruined halls, huddling against the cold. Soldiers of fortune patrolled the walls, eyeing Jon's men warily. They were led to a central chamber where Edmure Tully awaited, looking older and thinner than when Arya had last seen him at the Red Wedding, a memory she preferred to bury. His once red hair was streaked with gray, and lines of worry cut across his face. He wore threadbare finery, as if trying to cling to a dignity that the war had long stripped from him. When Jon introduced himself, Edmure offered a polite, if weary, greeting until he realized Arya was there. A flicker of emotion, part relief and part guilt, appeared in his tired eyes. "Arya," Edmure said, voice subdued, I thought you lost long ago. Your sister is at Winterfell, I heard?" My condolences for everything you've endured. He glanced at Jon. And you are Lord Snow? Or King Snow? I don't even know which titles matter now. Arya gave a curt nod. It's a long story, Uncle. Not one you'll like. Jon wasted no time. He explained the new reality, the unstoppable dead, the deal he had forged. Edmure's face grew ashen. He had spent enough time as a hostage to know the sting of subjugation, but this was far worse. Harrenhal's mercenaries were tough, but they were no match for a supernatural foe that had already toppled dragons and armies. The only question was how Edmure would respond. This is not a mere king who demands taxes, Jon told him, in the shadowed gloom of the throne room. The vaulted ceiling soared overhead, cracks letting in drifts of snow. It is a power that can raise the dead themselves. Harrenhal might be cursed, but that means nothing to them. If you try to hold out here, you'll die. And then they'll swell their ranks with your corpses. A hush followed his words. Edmure looked away, sorrow carved into every line of his face. Is there truly no one left to fight them? He asked quietly. The rumors said Daenerys Targaryen marched north with dragons. Arya's lips tightened. She did. They're all gone now. The dragons turned. The Night King has 3 of his own undead beasts. There is no fight left but this. Submit or perish. Edmure buried his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. After a moment he looked up, eyes wet. Then I have no choice. I can't doom these people. He gestured at the motley throng of Harrenhal dwellers who had gathered to listen. I have a wife and child. Somewhere my child is safe in Riverrun, or so I pray. But I have to protect whoever I can. If that means kneeling to this horror, so be it. Arya felt a wave of pity, remembering that Edmure's world had been turned upside down by the Red Wedding, by the Freys, by the Lannisters. Now this final blow left no illusions of heroism. He was a broken man, forced to swallow another humiliating subjugation. Jon nodded, gesturing for his men to prepare for the vow. As Edmure rose to his feet, Arya stepped away, the entire spectacle too familiar and too soul-crushing. Another keep, another submission, the same refrain of sorrow. Harrenhal's vow was taken in that cavernous hall, the voice of Edmure echoing forlornly. The mercenaries, for their part, were pragmatic. They, too, had no illusions. Selling their swords was worthless if the enemy was death itself. They bent the knee if grudgingly. Harrenhal, cursed or not, was added to Jon's tally of conquests for the Night King. Afterward, they were offered rooms for the night, drafty but better than sleeping in the open. Jon accepted. The men needed rest. That evening, as torches sputtered in the corridors, Arya found herself in an old antechamber with chipped stone floors. She had slipped away from her assigned room, restless. Through a crack in the wall, she could see a corner of the yard, where the mercenaries were lighting braziers for warmth. She wondered how many of them truly believed they were safe now, and how many realized they were only living on borrowed time. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. She tensed, but the silhouette that appeared was Jon's. He stepped into the chamber and saw her leaning against the wall. His face was drawn and tired, the torch he carried illuminating the hollows in his cheeks. "Arya," he said softly, "I was looking for you. Are you all right?" She shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "Fine. As fine as one can be in a cursed castle under the shadow of an undead king." He exhaled, setting the torch in a sconce. "Listen, I spoke with Edmure. He's broken by this, but he's not going to fight. We'll move on in the morning." Arya folded her arms. Where to next? Riverrun? The twins? King's Landing? She almost spat the last, remembering the blood and betrayal that had once stained those halls. Jon nodded, acknowledging her frustration. "Eventually, but first Riverrun. If the Tully banners still fly there, they'll need to bow." His voice fell to a whisper. "I hate it, Arya. Every day I hate what I'm doing. But there is no choice," Arya finished bitterly. "I know." Jon rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I can't keep saying it to you, because I know it hurts, but it's the truth. If I step off this path, the White Walkers will come. Everyone who's resisted, from the wildlings to Daenerys's host, is gone. I made this bargain to spare the realm from that fate." Arya stared at him in silence for a moment, wanting to lash out, wanting to say something that might break the suffocating inevitability of it all. Yet no words came. She understood the logic, but it did not soothe her disgust with what had become of House Stark's last scion of leadership. Finally, she blew out a breath. "Then I'll see you in the morning," she said curtly, pushing past him toward the door. Jon's hand caught her arm. She stiffened in reflex, but he didn't tighten his grip, merely rested it there. His eyes searched hers. "Thank you for staying with me," he said quietly. "I know you despise it, but having you here makes it a little less lonely." Arya's throat felt tight. She thought of the days they spent as children, chasing each other around Winterfell's yard or squabbling over archery practice. That world was long gone. She gently pulled her arm free. "Good night, Jon." He watched her go, a flicker of sorrow in his eyes, before she disappeared down the corridor. They left Harrenhal at dawn, after a meager meal of stale bread and salted meat that the castle could spare. Edmure and his entourage waved them off from the main gate, expressions heavy with resignation. The repeated routine had a dulling effect, as though each new keep was just another step in a slow funeral march across the land. Even the men in Jon's company, though loyal, looked drained. Soldiers by nature, they were forced to subdue the realm without swinging a single sword, merely by wielding the threat of the ultimate horror behind them. In the days that followed, the weather grew stormy. Flurries of snow thickened into real blizzards at times, forcing them to shelter in half-ruined farmhouses or under rocky overhangs. The Riverlands lived up to its name in spring or summer, but in winter, many waterways were frozen or clogged with ice. Occasionally, they forded half-frozen streams with the help of local guides who knew safe crossings. Some nights, Jon dreamt of the Night King's voice, a silent pressure in his skull, reminding him to hurry. The dead did not wait idly forever. It was only Jon's oath that prevented them from surging south en masse. Eventually, they arrived near the crossroads that split toward the Trident and Riverrun. Here, the land was dotted with muddy roads and frost-rimed brush. They encountered a small band of armed travelers who recognized Arya. To Jon's surprise, these travelers, simple riverfolk, fell to their knees upon seeing them, offering a plea for mercy. They had heard, evidently, that the Starks were collecting oaths on behalf of the undead. Rather than resist, these folk eagerly swore fealty on the spot, terrified of being turned into whites. The men in Jon's group didn't even have to brandish their weapons. Fear was enough, so the travelers were told to keep calm, follow the new order, and move along. The ease of it all weighed heavily on Jon. That evening, as they made camp in a sheltered grove, he confided to Arya that the speed of their conquest felt unnatural. "Even in the best of times," he said, "the Riverlands was full of fractious lords, Frey, Bracken, Blackwood, Mallister, others, but now they scatter like chaff in the wind. The dead hold them in a grip of terror." Arya had no comforting reply. They both knew it was to be expected. When you face an enemy that literally cannot be killed by conventional means, and that raises its victims to fight you, morale crumbles. She only watched as the men pitched tents, the winter wind howling through bare branches overhead. They reached Riverrun at mid-morning the following day. The ancient fortress perched on the bank of the Red Fork, though the water was partially frozen now, dull and gray under an overcast sky. The Tully banner still flew from the battlements, a leaping trout on a red and blue field, though it hung limp in the cold. Archers stood watch on the walls. A small outpost of soldiers guarded the gate, presumably loyal to the Tully name. When Jon's group approached, horns sounded in alarm. The men on the walls seemed uncertain, for they recognized the Stark sigil but also had heard the tales of what that sigil now represented. Jon halted out of arrow range, raising a hand for parley. Arya stayed close, scanning the walls for any sign of immediate hostility. A herald shouted down from the ramparts, demanding to know Jon's business. Jon responded, calling out that he came to speak with the lord or lady in command. The herald's expression was uncertain, but he disappeared, presumably to relay the message. After a tense wait, the gates opened a crack, and an envoy of Tully men rode out, led by a stocky knight in battered plate. This knight bore the Tully colors on his surcoat. He removed his helm to reveal a graying beard and wary eyes. "I am Ser Desmond Grell," he announced. "We serve House Tully. By what right do you approach?" Arya rode forward slightly, hood thrown back. "We are Starks," she said, voice carrying across the hush. "We come from Winterfell." Her tone brooked no contradiction, but her expression was grim. Jon added, "We need to speak with whoever leads the Tullys here. This is not a siege. If you deny us entry, we will speak from out here." Ser Desmond exchanged glances with his men, then nodded slowly. "Very well. My lords are within. We will escort you, but your company must remain outside the walls, except for a few among you." Jon agreed. He didn't need the threat of an army to scare them into submission, not if the rumors had preceded him. So he chose Arya and a couple of the more level-headed men to accompany him. The rest waited on the plain, building a small camp near the road. The gates opened further, the drawbridge lowered across the partially frozen moat, and they rode in under the watchful eye of dozens of armed Tully retainers. The atmosphere was tense. Inside the courtyard, they dismounted. Riverrun was better maintained than Harrenhal, less sprawling, fewer curses in its history. But the signs of war weariness were everywhere. Chipped battlements, scorched arrow slits, a thin population that huddled around fires for warmth. Ser Desmond led them through the gates to the Great Hall, where the Tully banners hung from the high rafters. There, awaiting them, stood a figure in warm robes and a fur mantle. Rosalind Tully, wife to Edmure Tully, once forced into marriage by Walder Frey at the infamous Red Wedding. She was older now, though still with the gentle demeanor that had softened Edmure's captivity. At her side stood a young boy with auburn hair, presumably their son. A handful of Tully knights and sworn swords flanked them, along with some Riverlands lords who had sought refuge after losing their own lands. Rosalind stepped forward, holding her son's hand. "Arya Stark," she said in a trembling voice, recognizing her. I had thought you gone with the rest of your family." Arya inclined her head, mouth set. "I escaped." She gestured to Jon. "This is Jon Snow, my brother." Rosalind's gaze flickered, uncertain. She must have heard the rumors of who Jon now served. Yet her courtesy won out. "You are welcome in Riverrun," she said carefully. "Though your mission here?" Jon took a breath. "We come to speak of the new order in the north and beyond. Your husband has already pledged to it at Harrenhal in a sense. But you hold Riverrun, so the vow must be made official here. The realm faces a threat like no other." Rosalind's eyes flickered with alarm at the mention of Edmure's name. "You saw my husband? Is he well?" Jon did not lie. "He lives, though he is weighed down by the same burden all of us share. Harrenhal has bent the knee. Now we need Riverrun to do the same." She gathered her courage, though her face was pale. "And if we do not?" Arya's hand closed into a fist, nails pressing into her palm. She spoke softly. "Then the army of the dead will come, and all who dwell here will die." A low murmur spread among the knights. The young boy at Rosalind's side glanced anxiously at his mother. Rosalind closed her eyes for a moment, trembling. "Then we have no choice." Ser Desmond stepped forward, his jaw set. "Are we truly to kneel before the White Walkers? Has House Stark given up every shred of honor?" Jon's voice was heavy. "Honor means nothing to a foe that can't be fought by normal means. Trust me, I've tried. We all tried, Daenerys Targaryen, the Night's Watch, the Free Folk. We failed. I made a bargain to spare the living from annihilation. This is the only way." The tension in the hall was palpable. Rosalind Tully sagged, shoulders trembling. She looked at her son, then back at Jon. "We will do as you ask," she said quietly. "For the sake of our children, I cannot choose certain death." Ser Desmond looked stricken, but he slowly bent the knee. Rosalind guided her son to do the same. One by one, the assembled knights and lords sank down, their voices hushed. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Arya watched them, that sick feeling in her stomach intensifying. Another castle, another vow, another day of living under the sword of the dead. She saw the shame in Ser Desmond's eyes, the heartbreak in Roslin's trembling frame, and she felt her own anger swirl deeper. When the vows were spoken, Jon delivered the usual reassurance. If they kept faith, the undead would not march here. Riverrun's people would survive. Roslin, tears in her eyes, asked about bringing her child to see his father. Jon promised there was no barrier to that so long as they adhered to the new order. That answer brought her little joy, but she thanked him nonetheless. As they departed the hall to return to their horses, Arya lingered behind for a moment, catching sight of Roslin's child. The boy gazed at Arya with frightened curiosity. She offered him a tight nod. "Be brave," she said softly, though it felt hollow. Then she hurried after Jon, the chill corridor echoing with her footsteps. They left Riverrun under leaden skies. The swirling gloom followed them, as if the very weather mirrored the hopelessness gripping the realm. Now the path stretched east, toward the ruins of the Twins or the scattered holdings that once belonged to rebellious houses. Or perhaps south, toward the heartlands of the Riverlands, eventually leading to the Crownlands. The closer Jon drew to King's Landing, the more uncertain he felt. Would Cersei Lannister still be on the throne, if she lived at all? The news had been spotty. Some said she had been deposed. Others said she was barricaded in the Red Keep, still clinging to power. In any case, the Iron Throne no longer truly mattered. The real power was the Night King's. But if the realm was to be fully subdued, they had to extend that submission to the seat of Targaryen and Baratheon kings, King's Landing. Jon planned to head there eventually to deliver the same ultimatum. Kneel or die. A part of him wondered if the city would burn before it surrendered. The seeds of conflict were sown thick in that place. For now, they pressed on. Another castle, another vow, another day. The men grew more silent with each new oath they witnessed, weighed down by the repetition of despair. Arya rode at Jon's side, scanning the horizon. Twice they encountered groups of bandits who tried to run off or fight, but as soon as they realized who approached, they tossed their weapons aside and pleaded for mercy. Even lawless brigands recognized that the dead were unstoppable, and they wanted no part in that war. One evening, while camped near a bend in the Red Fork, Arya overheard some of Jon's men muttering among themselves. They were complaining about how tedious the journey was, how they'd become harbingers of doom, collecting oaths like a grim tally. One man murmured that they might as well vanish into the countryside and run, because what difference did it make? Another hissed that running would only anger the Night King. He had ways of knowing. Arya could sense the fear saturating them. They felt trapped, just like everyone else. That night, as Arya lay in her bedroll, she dreamed of Winterfell in the days of her childhood. She dreamed of Ned Stark teaching Bran archery, of Rickon toddling around chasing Shaggy Dog, of Jon smiling shyly as he ruffled Ghost's fur. She dreamed of Sansa weaving a garland of flowers, of Catelyn fussing over them with gentle scolds. She dreamed of a world that was gone. Then the dream twisted, the sky turning black, the ground freezing underfoot, the wind howling with an unnatural shriek. She glimpsed the Night King at the gates of Winterfell, his icy gaze fixed on her family. She heard the cold voice in her mind, though it formed no words. Then she jerked awake, heart hammering. For a moment, she lay there, listening to the quiet breathing of the men. The embers of the campfire glowed faintly. Jon sat awake at the edge of the camp, facing the darkness, as if standing guard against nightmares. She rose, her breath steaming. Without a word, she moved to sit by him. He glanced at her, a question in his eyes, but he said nothing. They stared out at the starlit river, silent. At length, Arya asked in a low voice, "Jon, do you ever think there's a way out of this? Some secret that can free you from this vow?" Jon's shoulders tensed. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but I sense the bond. I feel him in my mind, always. He knows what I'm doing. I can't break free." Arya nodded, gaze on the running water. After a pause, she said, "What if the Night King is destroyed?" Jon let out a hollow laugh. "We tried that. We tried everything: Dragonglass, Valyrian steel, Dragonfire. We killed White Walkers, but the Night King was untouchable. He overcame the dragons, overcame the greatest forces we could muster." Arya's voice turned urgent. "But is he truly immortal? Maybe there's a secret we haven't discovered." She recalled the old legends, the children of the forest. She remembered how Bran had told them that the children created the White Walkers in the first place. "There has to be a way," she pressed. "Otherwise all of this is just a slow death, a life with no hope." Jon's eyes were bleak. "I wish I knew. But right now, if we so much as act against him, he'll know. He'll send his whites to slaughter everyone." Arya clenched her fists. "So that's it then?" Jon bowed his head. "That's it for now." A silent moment stretched. Then he glanced at her, voice low. "I understand if you want to leave. Go into hiding somewhere, where you won't have to watch this horror." Arya stared at him. "You want to send me away?" "No," Jon said quickly. "But I hate that you have to see this. You deserve better." She exhaled, her breath frosty. "If I left, I'd be running. That's not who I am. Besides, I can't leave you to face this alone." A flicker of gratitude appeared in his eyes, though sadness soon replaced it. "Thank you, Arya." They continued their journey the next day, encountering more pockets of submission in the Riverlands. Eventually, they turned their sights eastward, heading toward the twins. Though Walder Frey and his brood were all rumored to be dead, some said Arya Stark herself had cut them down. Someone had to be occupying that fortress, controlling the crossing of the Green Fork. If it stood unguarded, the realm's travelers and refugees would have poured through, but they had heard rumors that the gates were barred. They decided to see who was behind them. When they reached the twins, they found both of Walder Frey's great tower fortresses in disrepair. The drawbridges were up, the gates sealed. A ragged assortment of men bearing no clear sigil patrolled the walls. Perhaps they were brigands who had seized the crossing. Jon signaled his men to approach carefully. At the base of the fortress, a chunk of the moat was frozen. The watchers above shouted warnings. Brandishing crossbows and pikes, Jon shouted back that they came under the banner of House Stark, commanding parley. The watchers hesitated. They recognized the name, yet they also knew the stories. After a heated exchange, a single rope ladder was lowered from the tower to the frozen bank below, allowing Jon to climb up. Arya, of course, insisted on going with him. Their men waited below, weapons at the ready in case of betrayal. The climb was awkward, the rope swaying, the ice dangerously slick underfoot, but eventually, they scrambled onto the parapets, where half a dozen rough-looking fighters stood with crossbows aimed. Another man, apparently the leader, wore a tattered leather vest and had a scrawny beard. He introduced himself as Garth Stone, self-styled master of the twins now that the Freys were dead. He eyed Arya with suspicion. "Heard tell a Stark woman killed old Walder," he said. "Poisoned him and his kin. Was that you?" Arya's expression was cold. "Yes." The men around Garth exchanged uneasy looks. Garth forced a chuckle. "Well, that's impressive. But these towers are ours now. We're no friend to the Freys, so maybe we won't be your enemy. But what do you want here?" Jon's voice held quiet authority. "We want the twins to bend the knee to the new order. The Night King is unstoppable. We serve him now to spare the realm. You will do the same if you wish to live." Garth stared at Jon as though expecting a jest. When none came, he scoffed. "Bend the knee to a bunch of undead freaks? Is that a bad joke?" Arya's hand inched toward Needle. Jon's tone remained calm. "Not a joke. You can refuse if you like, but eventually the dead will come, and you will have no recourse. They've already destroyed armies mightier than anything you can muster." A tense hush followed. Garth glanced at his crossbow-wielding men. "We're not a big army, but these towers are strong. You can't just march in here." Arya's gaze narrowed. "Do you have families?" He gave a little shrug. "Some do," Arya said softly. "Then think of them. Is your pride in holding these towers worth them becoming whites? Or worse?" Garth's face darkened. We're not proud men. We're just men who found a place to survive after all the wars. You come and say you want us to kneel to a monster. It's easy for you to say, but we were never lords or knights, just small folk who got lucky. Now you want us to sign away our freedom all over again." Jon exhaled. "You never had freedom, not truly. None of us do anymore, not under the threat of the dead. This isn't about feudal lords or taxes. It's about life. You live only if you comply." Garth studied him for a moment. Then, with a bitter laugh, he motioned to his men. "Put the crossbows down." They obeyed, albeit reluctantly. Garth eyed Jon again. "Seems we got no choice." Arya reached into her pouch, withdrew a rolled parchment. She had taken to carrying around a rough document that spelled out, in blunt terms, the vow of submission. She extended it. "Sign this," she said. "It's mostly symbolic, but we keep a record." Garth grunted, took the parchment, spat on the ground, and pressed his thumbprint onto it in ink from a small pot one of Arya's men provided. That was the simplest method for those who couldn't read or write. One by one, his men did the same. When it was done, Garth gave them a sour look. "Go on, then. You can say the twins belongs to your undead king. We won't fight you." Jon nodded. "We'll pass through with our men, then be on our way. If you keep your vow, no harm will come." Garth's laughter was humorless. "No harm, unless your king changes his mind." He waved a hand at the gatekeepers. "Lower the bridges. Let them through. We're in the business of living a bit longer, I suppose." So it was done. Jon and Arya climbed back down, rejoined their company, and crossed the twins unopposed. No feasts, no formalities. Just a group of sullen, battered men letting them pass, fear overshadowing every gesture. On the far side, the old road continued south and east, eventually leading to the region around the Blackwater and King's Landing. With the twins now bent, the major crossing in the Riverlands was subdued. The entire region was, for all intents and purposes, under the Night King's dominion. The turn toward the Crownlands felt momentous. Jon gazed at the horizon, lost in thought. King's Landing, the largest city in Westeros, seat of the Iron Throne. Even though the realm's real power was now claimed by the dead, many still believed the occupant of that throne carried some authority. If that occupant refused to submit, a war could ignite that dwarfed all that had come before. And if that war ignited, the Night King would not wait on the sidelines. He would bring his full might south, 3 undead dragons, tens of thousands of whites, and the White Walkers themselves. Jon could feel the dread coiling in his gut. This was the tipping point. If they forced King's Landing to kneel, the entire realm would follow. The Stormlands, the Reach, Dorne, none would dare stand alone once the capital fell in line. But if King's Landing resisted destruction, he needed them to see sense. But Cersei Lannister, if she was still there, was not known for humble concessions. They took the main roads, passing occasional caravans and ragged groups of refugees. The cold deepened. Some outlying villages were empty, signs of old battles or plague. The golden fields of the Crownlands were shrouded in frost, the farmland bearing little. Some villages barricaded themselves, but upon hearing the dreaded rumor, "Kneel or the dead come," they invariably opened the gates, bent the knee, and prayed to the gods for a reprieve. Each day, another piece of the 7 kingdoms fell, not to the swords of men, but to the silent threat of an undead legion. After 2 more weeks of arduous travel, they crested a ridge, and in the distance, they saw it. King's Landing, perched beside Blackwater Bay. A haze of smoke rose from the city's many chimneys, giving it a sullen, gray-brown aura under the winter sky. The walls and towers bristled with defenses. The Red Keep loomed in the far corner, its red stones dark in the gloom. Even from leagues away, it looked formidable. Over 1 million souls lived behind those walls, or had lived before the wars and the winter. Now, who knew how many remained? Jon paused, reining in his horse. Arya and the men halted beside him, taking in the sight. A hush lingered, broken only by the wind. This was it, the final test of whether Westeros would yield without destruction, or if they would all be plunged into a fresh horror. Arya turned to Jon. "What's the plan?" Jon studied the distant walls, eyes somber. "First, we approach under a flag of parley. We explain what has happened. We make them understand it's pointless to resist. If they refuse, we ride away. And then, if the Night King wills it, the dead will come." He swallowed, the dryness in his throat acute. Arya nodded. She said nothing else. The men stirred, checking weapons, though they all knew that if a fight broke out, swords would do little good against the city's defenders. But Jon suspected the defenders would not see a small column as a threat. The real threat was the undead that could arrive at any moment. The question was whether those inside King's Landing had enough sense or desperation to kneel. With that silent determination, Jon spurred his horse forward. Arya matched his pace and the rest followed. They descended the ridge and made for the city gates, uncertain whether the capital of the Seven Kingdoms would open its doors in despair, or close them tight and spark the final war for the fate of Westeros. The column approached under a pale midday light, the city walls looming higher and higher. King's Landing's gates were known to be thick and imposing. Above the battlements, a few tattered banners snapped in the wind, the Golden Lion of House Lannister, and some more obscure sigils belonging to lesser houses that had thrown their lot in with the Queen. Jon tried to recall the last reliable piece of news about King's Landing. It was said that after Cersei Lannister's conflicts with Daenerys, she had consolidated what was left of her forces. Qyburn, the disgraced maester, might still be at her side, though no one knew for certain. The Golden Company had supposedly come from Essos at some point, but whether they remained was another mystery. So much had changed in the chaos of the war. When Jon and his people were within hailing distance, the guards on the walls called down, "State your business." They looked half-frozen, some in mismatched armor. Perhaps the chaos had taken a toll on the city's garrison. Jon raised his voice. "I am Jon Snow of House Stark. I come to speak with your queen on a matter of life and death." A hush, then laughter from one guard. "That's what they all say." Another guard, older, hissed at him to hush. Jon waited, letting them argue. At length, the older guard shouted down, "Wait here. We'll see if the Queen wants to grant an audience." Jon nodded. He knew they wouldn't simply open the gates on a whim. The men on the walls conferred, then one hurried off. Jon and his company remained in place, the wind cutting at them. The city's outer ring of defenses extended in formidable arcs. Moats, a barbican, and murder holes. Arya glanced up, brow furrowed. She had once known these walls from a different vantage, slipping into the city as a child. That seemed a lifetime ago. They waited for a solid hour, fidgeting in the cold. Some of Jon's men dismounted to stretch, stamping feet to keep warm. Arya remained on her horse, scanning every parapet for signs of archers or something worse. She half expected wildfire to come spewing from hidden caches. This city had always been a nest of treachery. Eventually, the older guard returned, shouting, "Her Grace has agreed to meet you in the outer yard. But only a small party, no more than 5. The rest of your men stay outside." Jon sighed, exchanging a glance with Arya. "Fine," he called. "Open the gate." The gates creaked open, the portcullis rattling upward. Jon signaled for 3 of his men to remain outside with the rest, in case of treachery. He and Arya, along with 2 more of their most trusted knights, guided their horses forward into the city's entrance. The gatehouse was dark and claustrophobic, but soon they emerged into a wide courtyard ringed by a second set of walls. Soldiers in red and gold livery lined the perimeter, armed with pikes and crossbows. Most looked underfed, eyes red with exhaustion. King's Landing had always been a hungry city in winter, and now, with the realm in chaos, conditions must be dire. At the far side of the courtyard, a small retinue waited. Standing at the center was Cersei Lannister herself. She wore a heavy black gown trimmed with gold, a fur cloak draped over her shoulders to keep out the chill. A gold crown rested on her blonde hair, which was cropped short, highlighting the lines on her face. She looked older than the last time Jon had seen her, bitterness carved into every contour. Beside her stood the towering shape of Ser Gregor Clegane, the mountain, or what remained of him, and a handful of Lannister guards. A man in simple black robes hovered nearby, perhaps Qyburn, though he looked even more gaunt than usual. A few courtiers lingered behind, fearful, uncertain. The entire scene felt staged, as though Cersei had chosen this courtyard deliberately to show the might she still possessed. Jon dismounted slowly, Arya and the two knights following suit. Cersei's eyes flicked over him, then at Arya, lingering as she recognized Ned Stark's daughter. She raised her chin. "Jon Snow," she said, her voice echoing in the hush. "So you survive, even after betraying me and consorting with my enemies." Jon forced himself not to bristle. "We've all lost, Cersei. The dead rule the North now. They annihilated Daenerys's armies, turned her dragons. That's why I'm here." She narrowed her eyes. "I've heard rumors, but I've also heard rumors that you're in league with them." Arya's jaw set, but Jon held up a hand, stepping forward. "Those rumors are true. I swore a vow to the Night King. It was the only way to save what's left of the living. If we didn't, his armies would have overrun the entire continent by now." Murmurs swept through the Lannister guards. Cersei's lips curled into a faint sneer. "I see. So you come to demand that I kneel to your new master." Jon met her gaze. "Yes, it's the only way for your people to survive. If you resist, the dead will come. And they won't stop until King's Landing is ashes and every one of you is a white." She let out a short laugh. "You think you can walk in here, a handful of riders at your back, and threaten me with an army that isn't even here? My city has withstood countless wars. We have walls, we have men, we have nothing that will stop 3 undead dragons." Jon interjected, his tone grave. "If you doubt me, ask those who saw Daenerys's armies fall. The Night King rides one of her dragons personally, while the other 2 serve him. Every arrow or scorpion bolt you have means nothing once he unleashes his storm of ice. And once your men die, they rise to join him." Cersei's face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes, perhaps fear or denial. Qyburn stepped forward, a hand wringing at his robes. "We have certain weapons," he said in that soft, rasping tone. "Your line is known to exaggerate, Lord Snow." Arya spoke up, voice harsh with contained anger. "Do you truly believe you can stand against the dead? Ask the men who saw the battle at the Fist of the First Men. Thousands burned under Dragonfire, but it wasn't enough. They don't fear normal weapons." Qyburn's expression twitched, but he stayed silent. Cersei pursed her lips, turning away as though to gather her thoughts. Gregor Clegane stood motionless, a horrifying sentinel behind her. Finally, she faced them again. "If I were to bend, hypothetically, I would place the entire city under the thrall of an inhuman power that might break the truce at any time. Is that better than dying on our feet?" Jon's voice dropped, a note of desperation slipping in. "I ask myself that every day. But if we fight, we lose everything. It's not just your soldiers who will suffer, but the million people in these walls. Do you want them all slaughtered, raised as whites to march south or overseas? This is the last bastion of the living. If we can keep it from burning, maybe in time we find a better path. But for now, we have no choice." Silence. Even the wind seemed to hush. Cersei stared at Jon, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, each word clipped. "You would have Cersei Lannister kneel in this courtyard, in front of all these witnesses, and proclaim fealty to your Mon Stroh's Night King." Jon nodded once. "Yes." Her eyes flickered to Arya, perhaps recalling how Arya had once threatened her family's entire hold on the North by supporting Daenerys. Then back to Jon. "Tell me this. When you have the city, will you slaughter your enemies? Will you tear the Red Keep apart? Loot my treasury? Punish me for all the wars?" Jon's face was grim. "We don't want gold or vengeance. The Night King only wants submission. If you yield, you live, and so does your city. You can keep your crown if you like, though it won't mean much. The real power is in the North, the power of death." Cersei's lips twisted in what might have been a bitter smile. A hollow throne, then? She let out a low, mirthless laugh. I spent my life fighting to rule the 7 kingdoms. And now you say there are no kingdoms left to rule. Arya stepped forward, voice sharp. If you prefer, we can walk away. Then, in a few days or weeks, the dead will come. They'll freeze the bay, tear down your walls, devour every living soul. Your choice. Cersei regarded Arya with a cold, assessing stare. You were always a savage little creature, weren't you? Then she turned away, pacing a few steps. She halted near Ser Gregor, who loomed silently. Qyburn hovered a pace behind her, clearly itching to speak, but she silenced him with a gesture of her hand. She seemed to weigh her next words. The Lannister guards, watching from the courtyard edges, shifted nervously. They had never seen their queen so uncertain. For years, she had projected unshakable authority, even in the face of dragons. But now, confronted with the unstoppable might of the undead, it was as if an inevitability weighed upon her. Finally, Cersei turned to Jon. You will give me time to consider. Jon opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand. A single day. Let me speak with my advisors, see if there's any alternative. I will give you my answer by tomorrow at noon. If you deny me even that courtesy, then kill us all here and now. Jon hesitated. He could feel the Night King's bond thrumming in the back of his mind, urging him to enforce immediate surrender. But pressing too hard might push Cersei to do something desperate. One day, Jon agreed grudgingly, but no longer. After that, we leave, and you'll have made your choice. Cersei inclined her head. So be it. She waved a dismissive hand at her guards. Show them to quarters in the outer ward. Let them remain under guard. We'll speak tomorrow. With that, she turned on her heel and swept away, Qyburn and Ser Gregor following. The Lannister soldiers parted to let her pass, then reformed ranks around Jon and Arya, indicating they should move. Arya frowned, glancing at Jon. He nodded, and they followed the guards into the labyrinth of King's Landing's outer defenses. They were taken to a modest tower near the gatehouse, provided a few cramped rooms. Guards stationed themselves outside, making it clear they were not free to wander as they pleased. Jon's 2 knights waited in an adjacent chamber. Arya paced their small room, scowling. This is a stalling tactic. Jon slumped in a battered chair, exhausted from the tension. Yes, she might be hoping to gather what forces she can, or to come up with a plan to kill us. But we can't force her to kneel faster. If she tries something, the dead will do the rest. Arya exhaled. Then we wait. They waited. The guards brought food, stale bread, thin stew, watery wine. Better than nothing. Night fell outside, the city's dim lights flickering across the rooftops. Jon stared out the narrow window, wondering how many thousands of innocents lived in these cramped streets, oblivious or in denial that the darkest threat in history loomed. He tried to imagine a path out of this nightmare, but no matter how he twisted his thoughts, the conclusion was the same. King's Landing must kneel or be destroyed. Meanwhile, in the Red Keep, Cersei held a secret council. Qyburn, her sole trusted advisor, hovered at her side. Euron Greyjoy was nowhere to be seen. He had sailed off months ago, perhaps deserted or dead. Her remaining generals were a half-dozen men of questionable loyalty, each battered by war. They gathered in the map room, the painted table of Westeros lit by torches. The air was cold, the fire in the hearth low. Cersei stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind her back. You've heard Jon Snow's ultimatum, she said. He demands we bow to this Night King or be obliterated. One of the generals, a gaunt man with a scar across his face, replied, Majesty, we cannot stand alone against the undead. Even Daenerys fell. We have no dragons left, no allies. Our best hope is to surrender. Cersei's eyes flickered with contempt. You speak of kneeling so easily? Another general stepped in. He's right. The Golden Company deserted after they learned of the undead threat. We have maybe 5,000 men left loyal to the crown, if that. Our walls are strong, but not strong enough to hold back 3 undead dragons. Qyburn cleared his throat. Your Grace, I have studied certain formulas. Wildfire caches remain beneath the city. We might detonate them if the undead come, incinerating them along with the entire populace, if it comes to that. Silence. One of the generals looked horrified. That would kill everyone. Qyburn nodded, expression impassive. Yes, but better that than to become whites, would you not agree? Cersei turned away, face taut. She had once been willing to blow the September of Baelor sky high to destroy her enemies. But the entire city, over 1 million souls? She stared at the painted table at the shape of Westeros. A twisted part of her would consider it, if only to deny the Night King his victory. Yet a flicker of maternal instinct, memories of her children, and a sense that she might yet cling to power, made her hesitate. She took a long breath. If I kneel, I live. I remain queen of these ashes. If I refuse, I risk annihilation. Or I might burn the city to deny the dead their prize. She turned to Qyburn, voice brittle. Is that all I'm left with? Is there no hidden weapon that might kill the Night King for good? Qyburn bowed his head. I have researched much, Your Grace. The legends speak of heroes, prophecies, swords of light. None of it bore fruit. Daenerys tried Dragonfire. You recall we heard rumors that it was not enough. Some old texts mention that the Night King was once a man, made into a monster by the children of the forest. Breaking that magic would require unimaginable power. The children themselves are gone. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, might know more, but he's in the north, presumably enslaved to the same vow as the rest. Cersei stood in silence, turmoil etched into her face. Her generals looked at her anxiously, waiting for a decision. After a long moment, she said, I will meet Jon Snow tomorrow. We will see if he can guarantee my survival. If so, perhaps I kneel. If not, her hand clenched into a fist. We do not go quietly. They all bowed. In the hush of the torchlit room, a sense of finality settled. Tomorrow, the city's fate would be decided. Morning broke gray and cold. A guard pounded on Jon's door, summoning him to the same courtyard. Jon, Arya, and their 2 knights emerged, stiff-limbed from a tense night. They were led past Lannister soldiers to the wide space where Cersei waited once again, wearing a heavy cloak of black velvet trimmed in fur. Gregor Clegane stood behind her, massive and ominous. A cluster of advisors hovered at a respectful distance. Cersei regarded Jon with narrowed eyes. I've considered your offer. I have a counter-proposal. Jon held himself steady. What is it? She gestured curtly. Qyburn stepped forward, clearing his throat. Her Grace will agree to kneel before this Night King if certain conditions are guaranteed. First, the city's population is to remain free from forced conscription into the undead ranks. Second, Her Grace retains the title of Queen in the South, with local authority over laws and justice. Third, Her Grace is assured that no White Walkers shall garrison the city nor impose martial law. Arya's hand twitched near her sword. You're in no position to demand terms. Cersei shot her a venomous look. This is not a negotiation of equals, I realize. But if we do not have some measure of autonomy, we might as well burn the city ourselves. Jon listened carefully. The conditions were not unexpected. Cersei wanted to preserve a semblance of power. He recalled how the other lords had asked for similar freedoms. None were forcibly given up, as the Night King had no interest in day-to-day governance. He only required obedience. The Night King won't place white garrisons unless you rebel, Jon said flatly. He doesn't care about your city's laws. You can call yourself queen, but it will mean little. As long as you do nothing to oppose his dominion, your people won't be harmed. Qyburn inclined his head. That is acceptable, Your Grace? Cersei's jaw was tense. She stared at Jon. And how do I know you're not lying? You don't, Jon said, except for the fact that I've visited keep after keep, all of which submitted, and none have been attacked so far. But if you prefer not to trust me, you can test your luck by defying us. See how that ends. She glared at him, Time stretched. Then, slowly, she sank to her knees. The courtyard gasped. Cersei Lannister, the proud lioness, the queen who had burned the September, was kneeling at Jon Snow's feet. She lifted her eyes, voice resonating with fury and despair. I, Cersei of the House Lannister, pledge myself and the City of Kings Landing to the will of the Night King. May the gods damn us all. Jon stood rigid, a swirl of conflicting emotions roiling within him. This was the final piece. King's Landing had bowed. With the capital under the new order, no region in Westeros could stand alone. The last hope of defiance had collapsed. He should have felt relief that the city would be spared, but he only felt a deeper chill in his soul. Rise, he said. You've done the only thing you can to keep your people alive. Cersei rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with suppressed hatred. Then we are done. She turned. The watchers behind her shrank away, as though feeling the heat of her anger. Qyburn bowed, hurrying to follow. Gregor Clegane cast a baleful glare at Jon and Arya before trailing after his mistress. Arya let out a slow breath. It's done. King's Landing belongs to the Night King. Jon nodded numbly. The men around them shared glances of disbelief. No battles, no sieges, no swords drawn. Yet the city had fallen all the same. The dead had conquered from afar, wielding fear as the ultimate weapon. Within hours, word spread throughout the city. The new order was announced by criers in the streets, explaining that the queen had knelt to an entity in the north called the Night King, that no one should oppose him under pain of extermination. The reaction among the populace was mixed. Some were too hungry and cold to care, seeing no difference between one distant tyrant and another. Others panicked, recalling the stories of White Walkers devouring armies. Yet what could they do? The city's gates remained shut, the guards patrolled, and life trudged on under the threat of a horror no one dared provoke. Jon and Arya stayed another night in the same tower. Cersei did not invite them to feast or discuss policies. She wanted them gone. By midday of the next day, they rode out through the gates, rejoining their company. They found the men waiting, blinking in astonishment at the news that King's Landing had surrendered without a fight. Jon addressed them in a weary tone. We've done what we set out to do. The capital has yielded. The only regions left are the Stormlands, the Reach, Dorne. But do they truly matter now? With King's Landing under the new order, it's only a matter of time before the rest bow on their own. If they don't, we can travel there. But I suspect they'll send envoys to pledge loyalty. One of the knights, a battered Northman who'd ridden with Jon since Winterfell, swallowed hard. It's over, then? Jon closed his eyes briefly. Almost. We'll keep going a bit longer. Ensure no major lords stand in defiance. But the realm is ours, in the Night King's name. Arya listened, arms folded. She felt no triumph, only a terrible emptiness. They had achieved the forced submission of the Seven Kingdoms. Over the coming weeks and months, the few pockets of resistance would be brought to heel. The unstoppable threat of the dead, plus the rumors of King's Landing's capitulation, would ensure no one dared raise a sword. If they did, that would be the end. They rode away from the capital, the road leading them toward the Stormlands, passing grim caravans of travelers who had left the city to seek better fortunes. Some recognized Jon, whispering fearfully. Others just looked away, not wanting to attract attention. As they traveled, they received ravens from far corners of Westeros, each carrying news of lords pledging fealty. House Tyrell was gone, swallowed up by Daenerys' earlier campaign. The new stewards of Highgarden apparently pledged quickly rather than risk an army of the dead on their doorstep. Dorne, ever distant, sent an envoy stating that while they had little love for northern kings, they preferred life over certain doom. So it went region after region. What had once been a tapestry of warring houses was now a patchwork of subjugated domains. The entire realm, from the Wall to the Arbor, was under the Night King's shadow. One afternoon, Arya approached Jon while they rode through a frosty glade. Where do we go now? Jon looked at her, his brow creased with exhaustion. I'd say we return to Winterfell, report our success to him. He didn't say the Night King's name, but Arya knew that was who he meant. She felt a chill. And what then? Jon's shoulders slumped. Then the realm enters a long peace. No more war so long as everyone obeys. The living farm, they toil, they try to survive. The dead remain in the north, watchful. If any region rebels, the White Walkers march. That's the new world. Arya stared at him, longing to see some spark of defiance, some plan for a final victory. But she saw only resignation. So we just live our lives as if everything is normal? I don't know, Jon admitted quietly. Perhaps. Or we keep searching for a solution, a hidden secret to break the bond. But we can't do that openly or he'll know. Arya clenched her jaw. Bran might know something. Or Sam. They read a lot of old books, studied magic. A faint flicker of hope glimmered in Jon's eyes. Perhaps. If we do that, it must be in secret. Arya nodded, a grim determination sparking. We'll see it through. One day, maybe this realm will be free again. Jon managed a tired smile, as if that dream was all he had left to cling to. Yes, one day. They continued onward, a silent procession traveling roads choked with snow and fear. For weeks more, they roamed the Stormlands, finding them largely deserted or eager to comply. The few lords who had not bent the knee sent word that they would do so. Gendry Baratheon, last rumored occupant of Storm's End, was nowhere to be found. Some said he'd gone north with Daenerys and was likely slain at the fist of the First Men. The massive keep of Storm's End was manned by a skeleton crew that quickly capitulated. The entire realm folded like a house of cards. Finally, when there was little left to pacify, Jon turned his column back toward the north. They had done it. The entire Seven Kingdoms lay under the dominion of the Night King, enforced by Jon Snow's dreadful ultimatum. Houses knelt, villages bowed. The common folk lived in anxious quiet. No new armies dared gather. No new alliances formed. Peace in a fashion had come, but it was a peace haunted by dread. The watchers on the ramparts looked north with fear that a legion of the dead might appear if someone stepped out of line. The old songs of knights and glory rang hollow. The only triumph was the absence of war. Yet the cost was freedom itself, pinned beneath the claws of an ancient evil that had turned the living's greatest champions into dust. As Jon rode with Arya and the men, crossing the Riverlands once more, he received the final raven from White Harbor, confirming that every corner of Westeros had sworn fealty. The vow was complete. Now they were expected to return to Winterfell, to stand before the Night King and confirm their success. The idea churned Jon's stomach. He recalled that chilling throne of ice, the hollow stares of the White Walkers. He had no illusions that the Night King would greet him with warmth or kindness. He was merely a tool, a mortal puppet. But if that prevented a genocide, so be it. One late afternoon, as they camped in a wooded clearing near the Neck, a messenger arrived on a half-starved horse. He bore the sigil of House Reed, but seemed near collapse from exhaustion. Jon's men ushered him to Jon's tent, where Arya and a few knights also waited. The messenger delivered a hurried account. He had come from Greywater Watch, where Lord Howland Reed had surfaced briefly to speak. He had a message for Jon Snow. Bran Stark wished him to come to the Isle of Faces. Jon tensed. Bran? Why the Isle of Faces? The messenger, trembling and clearly scared, explained that Bran had visited Greywater Watch in secret, traveling with a small escort. He spoke in cryptic terms about the source of the other's power, the ancient pact between the Children of the Forest and the First Men, which had been sealed on the Isle of Faces centuries ago. According to Bran, if there was any place left in the realm that might hold a clue to undoing the Night King, it was there. Arya caught her breath, glancing at Jon. Could it be true? Jon swallowed. Bran, he sees things we can't. If he believes it's worth investigating, we must try. He turned to the messenger. When did Bran leave? Yesterday, the messenger replied, wiping sweat from his brow. He said you should join him as soon as you can. Lord Reed pledged to guide you there if needed, or at least provide directions. The swamps are tricky, but the Isle is accessible from the God's Eye if you know the path. Jon weighed this news carefully. The Night King expected him in Winterfell. He would sense if Jon delayed too long. But if there was any chance that the Isle of Faces held the key to breaking the undead dominion, Jon had to risk it. He felt the faint chill of the bond in his mind, warning him not to stray from the path. Yet he could justify a detour if it was disguised as part of his return north. The God's Eye was in the southern Riverlands, near Harrenhal. They weren't too far from it. He looked at Arya. She nodded, reading his thoughts. "We have to try," she said. Jon turned to the assembled men. "We continue north, but we'll make a stop near Harrenhal. Anyone who wishes to return directly to Winterfell may go ahead. But keep our real destination quiet. We don't want the Night King to suspect anything unusual." Most of the men were too weary or frightened to protest. A handful said they would go straight to Winterfell to avoid any further entanglements. Jon let them. He and Arya took a smaller contingent of loyal soldiers who might keep a secret. They parted ways, forging a path that would lead them back to the heart of the Riverlands. If Bran was waiting on that mysterious island in the middle of the God's Eye, perhaps they would find a thread of hope. Harrenhal loomed again on the horizon, its blackened towers stark against the leaden sky. Jon's reduced party Kurt the fortress, crossing the same roads they had traveled before. Edmure Tully and his people still resided there under the new order. Jon had no desire to stop, aware that it might draw attention. Instead, they camped in a wooded hollow near the lake's shore, carefully hidden from prying eyes. The God's Eye was a vast lake, ringed by old weirwood trees in certain areas. Legends said that in its center lay the Isle of Faces, where the first men and the children of the forest had signed their ancient pact, ending centuries of bloodshed. The isle was rumored to be haunted by green men who tended the weirwoods, or perhaps the spirits of the children themselves. Few mortals ever dared set foot there, yet that was exactly where Bran wanted them to go. They spent a day scouting the shoreline, looking for a boat or a safe crossing. Eventually, they found a rickety skiff moored in a hidden inlet, possibly used by fisherfolk. Jon's men built a rough raft as well, just in case. The waters were partially iced over, but not fully frozen. The lake was large enough and not as deeply in winter's grasp as the north. By dusk, Jon, Arya, and a handful of men pushed off from the shore, rowing carefully through the eerie calm of the lake. Mist gathered on the surface, swirling around them. The distant shape of Harrenhal's towers vanished behind drifting fog. In the front of the skiff, Arya clutched a lantern, guiding the way. The men paddled, breath steaming, arms trembling with each stroke. Even with the season, the air felt marginally less frigid here than in the far north, but the damp chill of the lake seeped into their bones. Time stretched oddly on the water. Now and again, shapes loomed in the fog, small wooded outcroppings that turned out to be thick patches of reeds. Once they nearly ran aground on a submerged log. Jon kept scanning the mist for any sign of the island. He felt tense, as though the Night King's presence in his mind had sharpened, like an unspoken suspicion. Yet so far, no whites or White Walkers appeared. Then Arya caught a glimpse of pale trees ahead. "Weirwoods," she whispered. The men slowed, letting the skiff drift closer. The mists parted, revealing a small shore of pebbles at the edge of a heavily wooded islet. Great weirwood trees loomed, their bark bleached white, their leaves crimson, as if in eternal autumn. The silhouettes were strange, old, twisted. A hush fell over the company. They landed on the shore, dragging the skiff up onto the pebbles. The second raft, bearing 4 more men, bumped alongside them. Jon instructed them to stay alert but remain by the boats in case they needed to leave quickly. Then he and Arya ventured deeper into the trees, torches in hand. The forest was thick, the ground soft with fallen leaves. A faint glow filtered through from somewhere ahead, or perhaps it was a trick of moonlight. They had not gone far when a voice called from between the trunks. "You've come!" Jon froze. Arya lifted her torch. Bran Stark emerged from the shadows, seated in his wheeled chair, which was guided by Meera Reed. Meera looked older than the last time Arya had seen her. Her hair was streaked with silver at the temples, her face lined by hardship. But she offered a small, relieved smile. Bran, for his part, looked much the same as before, eyes distant with that eerie calm. Arya stepped forward, dropping to one knee so she could embrace Bran. He allowed the brief hug, though he was Kurt the fortress, crossing the same roads they had traveled before. Edmure Tully and his people still resided there under the new order. Jon had no desire to stop, aware that it might draw attention. Instead, they camped in a wooded hollow near the lake's shore, carefully hidden from prying eyes. The God's Eye was a vast lake, ringed by old weirwood trees in certain areas. Legends said that in its center lay the Isle of Faces, where the first men and the children of the forest had signed their ancient pact, ending centuries of bloodshed. The isle was rumored to be haunted by green men who tended the weirwoods, or perhaps the spirits of the children themselves. Few mortals ever dared set foot there, yet that was exactly where Bran wanted them to go. They spent a day scouting the shoreline, looking for a boat or a safe crossing. Eventually, they found a rickety skiff moored in a hidden inlet, possibly used by fisherfolk. Jon's men built a rough raft as well, just in case. The waters were partially iced over, but not fully frozen. The lake was large enough and not as deeply in winter's grasp as the north. By dusk, Jon, Arya, and a handful of men pushed off from the shore, rowing carefully through the eerie calm of the lake. Mist gathered on the surface, swirling around them. The distant shape of Harrenhal's towers vanished behind drifting fog. In the front of the skiff, Arya clutched a lantern, guiding the way. The men paddled, breath steaming, arms trembling with each stroke. Even with the season, the air felt marginally less frigid here than in the far north, but the damp chill of the lake seeped into their bones. Time stretched oddly on the water. Now and again, shapes loomed in the fog, small wooded outcroppings that turned out to be thick patches of reeds. Once, they nearly ran aground on a submerged log. Jon kept scanning the mist for any sign of the island. He felt tense, as though the Night King's presence in his mind had sharpened, like an unspoken suspicion. Yet so far, no whites or White Walkers appeared. Then Arya caught a glimpse of pale trees ahead. "Weirwoods," she whispered. The men slowed, letting the skiff drift closer. The mists parted, revealing a small shore of pebbles at the edge of a heavily wooded islet. Great weirwood trees loomed, their bark bleached white, their leaves crimson, as if in eternal autumn. The silhouettes were strange, old, twisted. A hush fell over the company. They landed on the shore, dragging the skiff up onto the pebbles. The second raft, bearing 4 more men, bumped alongside them. Jon instructed them to stay alert but remain by the boats in case they needed to leave quickly. Then he and Arya ventured deeper into the trees, torches in hand. The forest was thick, the ground soft with fallen leaves. A faint glow filtered through from somewhere ahead, or perhaps it was a trick of moonlight. They had not gone far when a voice called from between the trunks. "You've come." Jon froze. Arya lifted her torch. Bran Stark emerged from the shadows, seated in his wheeled chair, which was guided by Meera Reed. Meera looked older than the last time Arya had seen her. Her hair was streaked with silver at the temples, her face lined by hardship, but she offered a small, relieved smile. Bran, for his part, looked much the same as before, eyes distant with that eerie calm. Arya stepped forward, dropping to one knee so she could embrace Bran. He allowed the brief hug, though he was stiff. Jon joined, placing a hand on Bran's shoulder. For a moment, they were 3 Stark children in the dark heart of an ancient forest, bridging the ravages of time and war. After that moment, Arya pulled back, voice quivering. "You're here. We thought you'd be in Winterfell." Bran inclined his head. "I had to come. The Isle of Faces is where the pact was made, and perhaps where it can be unmade." Jon's heart pounded. "So you believe there is a way to break the White Walkers?" Bran's lips parted, and for a moment, he looked almost humanly uncertain. "I've seen many paths, many futures. The magic that created the Night King was wrought by the children of the forest in the lands of Always Winter. But the pact that ended the war between the children and the first men was forged here. The Weirwoods hold memories older than we can comprehend. If anywhere in Westeros can show us how to sever the tie that binds the Night King to his power, it is here. Arya swallowed. What do we do? Bran shifted in his chair, gesturing behind him. Deep in the heart of the grove, there is a circle of Weirwoods. The faces carved there are older than any living memory, older perhaps than the long night itself. I must try to enter the tree's memories, to see what was done in ancient times. But I need your help, both of you. Blood of the first men, watchers on the walls, living ties to the realm. Jon felt a chill. He recalled that the old gods and the Weirwood network had once allowed the Greenseers to see beyond mortal sight. Bran had used it to gather knowledge in the war. Now they sought an even deeper mystery. We'll help. Tell us what to do. Bran's eyes, pale and reflective, flicked between them. Guard me while I walk in the past. And if I learn how to undo the Night King, be prepared. He may sense it. He may come. Arya's face set with determination. We're not afraid. Mira Reed guided Bran's chair deeper into the forest. The towering Weirwoods seemed to lean in, branches swaying without wind. Jon and Arya followed, torches casting dancing shadows. The ground underfoot felt soft, almost spongy, with centuries of fallen leaves. The air smelled of earth and something older, a faint tang that might have been sap or blood. It was hard to distinguish in the gloom. At length, they came upon a clearing where half a dozen ancient Weirwoods formed a ring, each trunk carved with a solemn face. The faces were worn by time and the elements, their carved eyes streaked with red sap that gave the impression of tears. The clearing radiated a hush that pressed on the senses, as though the veil between worlds was thin here. Bran pointed. "Place me by that tree," he said, indicating the largest trunk with a particularly stark face. Mira pushed the chair forward until Bran was within arm's reach of the carved bark. He lifted a hand, pressing his fingers to the pale wood. Immediately, his eyes rolled back, and his breathing slowed. He was warging into the Weirwood net or something deeper. Arya and Jon positioned themselves on either side. Mira stood nearby, clutching her spear, her eyes scanning the perimeter with wary focus. The forest around them rustled with unseen life. Jon extinguished his torch to avoid drawing too much attention. A faint moonlight filtered through the canopy, enough to see. Arya's hand rested on Needle's hilt. Ready. For what felt like hours, they waited. Bran's breathing remained slow. His eyes turned white, lost in some immense vision. The Weirwood's carved face seemed to glisten with fresh red sap, as though reacting to his presence. Jon tried to stay calm, but he felt the bond with the Night King thrumming in his mind. It was as though the ancient evil sensed a threat. He braced himself, half expecting to see an army of wights erupt from the trees. But the night remained still, at least for now. Then Bran began to shudder. His lips parted, no sound emerging at first, then a low groan. Arya crouched beside him, touching his arm. "Bran!" His voice came out choked. "I see it. They used his blood. The children. Tied him to the heart of winter, the first long night. They gave him the power to raise the dead. But it can be undone. There is a place of making in the far north, near the lands of always winter, a heart tree carved with runes. If we can break the magic there, the Night King falls." Jon's heart pounded. How do we break it? Bran's face contorted, as if straining to hold onto the vision. With blood of the one who shares his power, ice and fire, your blood, Jon. You are bound to him. A sword of dragon steel or Valyrian steel must pierce the runes, while the blood of the king's champion is spilled. He gasped, voice quivering. It will break the bond. The others will fall. But the champion who does this must die. A hush enveloped the clearing. Arya's eyes darted to Jon, tears threatening. Jon swallowed, mind racing. You mean, I have to sacrifice myself? Bran's eyes remained rolled back. The blood of the king's champion. You are bound by oath. That oath must be severed by your life's blood. It is the only way. Otherwise, the long night never ends. Arya clenched her fists. There has to be another way. You can't. Bran's voice trembled with an otherworldly echo. No other way. This is the cost. He convulsed once more, then slumped, eyes fluttering closed. Mira pressed her hand to his cheek, checking his pulse. Slowly, Bran regained normal consciousness, blinking as though disoriented. Jon bowed his head, a heavy silence pounding in his ears. A swirl of emotions raged. Horror, resignation, a flicker of relief that there was a solution at all. I see, he said at last, voice hollow. Arya turned to him, anger and grief crossing her face. No, we'll find another way. We can't just. Jon cut her off softly. If this is the only way to free the realm, Arya, then I'll do it. She shook her head, tears threatening. You just spent all this time saving people. You can't. Jon placed a hand on her shoulder. I made a vow to save them. This will do it permanently. If my life is the price, then so be it. A sob tore from Arya's throat, but she forced it back, her eyes burning. Mira looked at them with a sorrowful understanding. Bran, still groggy, lifted his gaze. We must go to the Heart Tree, in the far north. The White Walkers will guard it. The Night King will sense our approach. But if we succeed, his power collapses in one stroke. Jon's heartbeat thundered. We'll have to do it secretly, or else he'll bring his entire host. Bran nodded, eyes focusing. We can't fight them all. We must be swift.